Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. The last walk home. The streetlights flickered as Emma tightened her scarf against the cold autumn breeze. The chill seemed sharper that night, biting through her jacket and into her skin. She was heading home after her late shift at the diner, her feet aching from standing all day. It was a route she had taken countless times before, weaving through quiet residential streets lined with dimly lit houses. Normally, she found this solitude comforting, a time to unwind. But tonight felt different. The air was unusually still, almost heavy, like it was waiting for something. The rhythmic sound of her boots against the pavement was the only noise, echoing in the emptiness. Emma glanced at her phone, the glow of the screen briefly illuminating her face. 10 minutes to home, it said, but the time felt abstract, meaningless. She pocketed the device and walked on, the growing sense of unease tightening her chest. Halfway down Cedar Street, Emma heard it, a faint shuffle behind her, too quiet to be wind, too rhythmic to be random. She stopped, her breath catching, and turned. The street stretched behind her, empty except for the faint shadows of swaying tree branches. "Get a grip," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head. She resumed her pace, faster now, her boots clicking against the concrete. But the sound came again, louder this time, deliberate footsteps matching her speed. She spun around, her heart hammering. Still, there was no one. Her breathing quickened as she scanned the street, her eyes darting to the darkened windows of the houses. Most of the porch lights were off, the neighborhood bathed in shadow. She debated texting someone, anyone, but the ridiculousness of the idea held her back. No one would believe her, not without proof. The footsteps started again, closer now, and this time Emma didn't wait to investigate. She broke into a jog, her bag bouncing against her hip as she moved. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out everything else. She risked a glance over her shoulder, and her stomach plummeted. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and cloaked in darkness. They were walking, not running, but their pace was unrelenting, purposeful. Emma's legs burned as she pushed herself faster. The end of Cedar Street was in sight, where the main road and its traffic lights promised safety. She just had to make it there. The figure followed, their strides eerily silent now, as if the world itself muffled their presence. Emma turned sharply onto Maple Avenue, her lungs straining with every breath. The streetlights here were brighter, their glow painting the pavement in soft yellows, but it offered little comfort. Suddenly, a car turned onto the street ahead, its headlights sweeping over her. Relief surged through her chest. She waved frantically, shouting for help, but the driver didn't slow. The car passed her and disappeared around the corner, leaving her in the silence once more. She glanced back. The figure had stopped, standing at the corner of Maple and Cedar, their forms shrouded in darkness. They tilted their head as if watching her, studying her. Then, they stepped backward, fading into the shadows like a memory slipping away. Emma's knees buckled, and she leaned against a street lamp, struggling to catch her breath. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, jolting her back to reality. With shaking hands, she pulled it out. The screen lit up with a text from her roommate. "Are you almost home? I heard someone outside. Her heart froze. Emma turned, her gaze darting to the houses ahead. She was close now, just a few minutes away. But the thought of going home, of being inside with only a locked door separating her from whatever or whoever was out there, made her stomach twist. She typed back quickly, "Stay inside. Lock everything. Call me if you hear anything else." The street was quiet again, too quiet. Emma forced herself forward, her legs trembling with each step. Her house came into view, its porch light glowing faintly in the distance. She fumbled for her keys as she approached the door, her fingers cold and unsteady. Before she could unlock it, a sound behind her froze her in place, a low, deliberate whistle. Emma turned slowly, her back pressed against the door. The figure stood in the middle of the street, illuminated faintly by the far-off streetlights. They raised a hand, not in a wave, but in a slow, deliberate gesture, pointing directly at her. Her phone slipped from her grasp, clattering onto the porch as her breath hitched. The figure didn't move closer, but the intensity of their presence pressed down on her like a weight. Summoning every ounce of courage, Emma grabbed her phone, unlocked the door, and slipped inside, bolting it behind her. She leaned against the wood, tears stinging her eyes as she slid down to the floor. The next morning, she found no trace of the figure. But on the sidewalk in front of her house, written in faint chalk letters, were 2 words. Not yet. Emma never walked home alone again. The Watcher in the Forest. I always took the same trail for my evening walks. It wound through the edge of the forest, following the creek that bubbled softly, a sound that usually soothed me after long, stressful days. Max, my miniature schnauzer, trotted beside me, his little legs working double time to keep up. He was always so confident, his tail curved upward like a proud little flag. But tonight felt wrong. It wasn't anything obvious at first. The air was heavy, damp with the promise of rain that hadn't yet come. The sun was long gone, and the sky had turned a deep indigo, the last threads of twilight barely clinging to the horizon. The trail was darker than usual, shadows stretching out like long, skeletal fingers. Max's ears perked up suddenly, and he froze mid-step, his body tense as a coiled spring. I followed his gaze into the dense brush to our right. At first, I saw nothing but leaves shifting gently in the breeze. "What is it, buddy?" I whispered, trying to sound calm. Max didn't respond. He let out a low, trembling growl, something I'd never heard from him before. My heart thudded harder in my chest. He was a curious dog by nature, always eager to chase after squirrels or bark at passing joggers. But this was different. I tugged at his leash, but he didn't budge. His eyes stayed locked on the trees, his growl growing deeper, more insistent. "Probably a raccoon," I said, as much to him as to myself. But I wasn't convinced. The shadows seemed darker here, denser. My phone's flashlight barely pierced the gloom as I shone it into the trees. The beam wavered, shaky in my trembling hand. Then I saw it, just a flash of movement, too quick to make out. Something large enough to rustle the branches. "Let's go, Max," I urged, tugging harder this time. He whined but finally relented, sticking so close to my legs that he nearly tripped me. We continued down the trail, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder, my heart skipping at every shadow that shifted in the corner of my vision. The comforting sounds of the creek and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots now felt oppressive, like a soundtrack to something watching, waiting. That's when I heard it, the soft crunch of leaves just behind us. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The sound stopped too. My flashlight beam wavered as I swung it around, illuminating nothing but empty trail and the faint outlines of trees. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The silence that followed was deafening. Max pressed closer to me, his body shaking. He let out another low growl, and his hackles stood on end. I turned back toward the direction we were heading, my pulse pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Almost home," I murmured, more to myself than to him. We picked up our pace, almost jogging now. But the footsteps behind us picked up too, no longer trying to stay hidden. They were steady, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to an animal. I risked a glance over my shoulder and froze. A figure stood at the edge of my flashlight beam, just far enough away that I couldn't make out their features. They were tall, draped in something dark and tattered that shifted in the breeze. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, staring. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice breaking. No response. Max barked, sharp and frantic, as if urging me to run. My legs obeyed before my brain could catch up. I sprinted down the trail, Max bounding beside me, his leash tugging hard against my grip. The footsteps behind us broke into a run too, louder, faster, closing the distance with terrifying ease. The trail curved sharply ahead, leading to the footbridge that crossed the creek. Relief flooded me for a moment. I knew this bridge. Beyond it was the residential street, safety. But as I rounded the bend, I skidded to a halt. Another figure stood at the far end of the bridge, perfectly still. They were identical to the one behind me, same height, same dark, tattered clothing, same ominous stillness. "No, no, no," I whispered, my breath hitching. Max barked again, his barks turning into frantic yips as he tugged me toward the overgrown side trail that veered off to the left before the bridge. It was steep and barely visible, but it led up to the street near my neighbor's house. Without thinking, I plunged into the side trail, pushing through wet branches and slipping on loose leaves. Max practically dragged me forward, his small body surging with a strength I didn't know he had. Behind me, the footsteps didn't stop. I could hear them crashing through the underbrush, closer now, relentless. The streetlights came into view, their warm glow like a beacon through the trees. I stumbled onto the pavement, gasping for air, my knees nearly buckling beneath me. "Evening, Sarah," a familiar voice called out. I turned to see Mrs. Chin watering her flowers in her front yard. The sight of her calm, smiling face brought tears to my eyes. "You and Max are out late," she added, her cheerful tone oblivious to the panic coursing through me. I managed a shaky wave, clutching Max's leash so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't dare look back at the trail entrance. I didn't need to. Max didn't stop growling until we were inside, every door and window locked tight. Even then, his ears stayed perked, his eyes darting to every shadow that shifted outside. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, just paranoia fueled by a long day and the eerie quiet of the forest. But deep down, I knew better. Something had been out there, and I had a feeling it wasn't done with me yet. The room on the 12th floor. It was supposed to be an ordinary work trip. The company had booked me a room in a hotel downtown, an older building with a worn charm that seemed frozen in time. When I arrived, the desk clerk handed me the key card with a polite but tired smile. "You're in 1203, she said. The elevator ride was slow, the kind that hums ominously and jerks slightly between floors. By the time I reached the 12th floor, I was already uneasy. The hallway was dimly lit, the carpet worn thin, and the air heavy with an unplaceable scent, something metallic, almost. Room 1203 was at the far end of the hall. The door creaked slightly as I unlocked it, revealing a standard hotel room, beige walls, a queen-sized bed, a desk near the window. It was nothing remarkable, but something about it felt off. The air inside was stale, as though the room hadn't been aired out in weeks. I crossed to the window and pulled back the heavy curtains, letting in the dull glow of the city below. It helped, but not much. As I unpacked, I noticed little things that seemed out of place. The desk chair was slightly askew, as though someone had left in a hurry. The bathroom mirror had faint smudges, almost like handprints. And then there was the closet door. It was slightly ajar. I hesitated, staring at the dark gap between the door and the frame. Something about it made my skin crawl. Swallowing hard, I forced myself to walk over and pull it open. The closet was empty, save for a few hangers and a faint smell of mothballs. "Get a grip," I muttered, trying to shake off the unease. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the building made my heart race. I told myself it was just an old hotel, that old buildings make noises, but it didn't help. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up and decided to scroll through my phone to distract myself. That's when I heard it. A faint tapping sound. It came from the closet. I froze, the blood draining from my face. For a long moment, I didn't move, didn't breathe, straining to hear. The tapping came again, rhythmic and deliberate, like fingers drumming against wood. I grabbed the bedside lamp, holding it like a weapon as I inched toward the closet. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. No response. With a deep breath, I yanked the door open, the lamp raised high. The closet was empty, just as it had been earlier. My heart thundered as I stared into the darkness, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the room was silent again, and after a few minutes, I closed the closet door and retreated to the bed, still clutching the lamp. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because I woke to sunlight streaming through the window. The room felt different in the daylight, less oppressive. I almost convinced myself it had all been in my head. But then I noticed the closet door. It was open. Wide open. My suitcase, which I had left zipped shut beside the bed, was now halfway across the room, its contents spilling out onto the floor. My breath caught as I backed away toward the door, grabbing my phone and room key. As I stepped into the hallway, I nearly collided with the housekeeper, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes. "Good morning," she said, eyeing my pale face. "Is everything all right?" I hesitated, then blurted, "Was someone in my room last night?" She frowned. "No, not unless you let them in. Only guests have keys." I told her about the noises, the closet, the suitcase. Her expression darkened. "Which room were you in?" she asked. 1203. She froze, her eyes widening slightly. "That room? We don't usually book that one. She stopped herself, shaking her head. "I'll let the manager know. Maybe we can move you to another floor." I didn't wait for the manager. I packed my things in record time, barely stopping to shove everything into my suitcase before bolting for the elevator. As I handed him my key card at the front desk, the clerk gave me a curious look. "Leaving early?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. Change of plans. She nodded, her gaze flickering to the computer screen. That's strange, she murmured. What is? Her eyes met mine, confused. It says here that room 1203 hasn't been booked for months. It's supposed to be closed for maintenance. I didn't reply. I just walked out of the lobby and into the bright morning light, swearing to myself that I would never step foot in that hotel or on the 12th floor again. The last shift. The night was cold as I walked down the narrow path behind the university library. I had stayed late, thinking I could get some extra studying in, but by the time I realized how tired I was, it was already well past midnight. The campus felt unusually silent, and the flickering street lamps gave the entire area a ghostly hue. I shoved my hands deeper into the pockets of my jacket, wishing I hadn't taken this path. It felt like the kind of place where bad things could happen when no one was around. The library doors had already been locked behind me, and my phone had no signal, so I figured I might as well head to the parking lot. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling in my stomach. Nothing unusual had happened, but for some reason, my mind was racing. There was a distant sound, almost like a faint scratching, but I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. I picked up my pace, my footsteps echoing against the walls of the quiet building. As I passed the side entrance, I noticed the lights above me flickering. I paused for a moment, staring at the weak glow above. The bulb seemed like it might burn out any second. It didn't help with the unease creeping up my spine. A sound from inside the library broke my thoughts, a low thump, almost as if something had fallen or been knocked over. I froze. There shouldn't have been anyone else there. The library had closed hours ago. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as some mechanical noise from the old building. But something kept pulling at me, urging me to look back. I hesitated, my feet feeling like lead, but I eventually turned. Nothing. Just the darkened windows, the faint reflection of the streetlights bouncing off the glass. I exhaled sharply, trying to calm myself, and kept walking. The path ahead stretched on, almost unnaturally long. That's when I noticed something else. The streetlights behind me were out. The light that had been guiding me had disappeared. It was too quiet now. The silence felt like a pressure wrapping itself around me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. But then, the silence was broken again. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, sounded from behind me. I whipped around, heart pounding. There was nothing there. My pulse raced. I had to get to my car, had to get out of this place, but my legs felt heavy, as though they were made of lead. I quickened my pace, but the footsteps followed, always at the same slow rhythm, as if they were mocking me. Suddenly, the streetlights flickered and then went out completely. I was plunged into darkness, save for the dim glow coming from the nearby dorms, a small comfort that felt miles away. My phone was useless. I glanced nervously around. Then, I saw it. A figure appeared at the end of the path, standing still in the darkness. I couldn't make out its features, but I felt its eyes on me, like they were piercing through the night. My breath hitched in my throat. The figure took a slow step forward. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran, heart hammering in my chest, my feet slipping on the wet pavement. The cold night air burned my lungs as I sprinted toward the parking lot, the sound of my own footsteps and the unseen ones still haunting me, growing louder with each passing second. I reached my car, almost throwing myself into the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the car into gear, tires screeching as I sped out of the lot. Looking back in the rearview mirror, I saw nothing. But I could still feel the presence, like it was waiting for me to turn around again. I didn't. The hollow floor. I had been working late, as usual. I'd been a night janitor at the same office building for nearly 3 years, and every night was the same routine. Sweep the floors, take out the trash, clean the restrooms, then lock up. By the time I finished, the building was always silent, and the streets outside were empty, save for the occasional car passing by. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills. That night, something felt different. The air inside the building had an odd chill, even though the heating was running fine. The lights seemed dimmer, and there was a faint hum that I hadn't noticed before. At first, I chalked it up to the late hour, the fatigue from the day. But as I made my way down the empty hallways, the strange feeling refused to shake off. The building was located on the outskirts of town, a modern glass and steel structure that looked more like a skyscraper in a city than anything else in the area. It was all clean lines and shiny floors, nothing particularly memorable except for one thing, the elevator. I've always hated that elevator. It wasn't that it was old or particularly creaky, quite the opposite, actually. It was one of those high-tech, glass-walled elevators with a smooth, almost silent motion. It was just that it was always too quiet. Whenever I was near it, the faintest sense of something wrong crept over me, like there was something unnatural about its stillness. Maybe it was just me, but I never liked it. But on that night, I had no choice but to use it. The floors were quiet, empty, and I had to go down to the basement storage area to fetch some cleaning supplies. I walked past the rows of empty cubicles, the dim light reflecting off the polished floors, and reached the elevator. I pressed the button to call it, but as the doors slid open, I froze. The interior was darker than usual, as if the lights inside had been dimmed. I almost turned around and took the stairs, but the thought of climbing down 10 flights made me reconsider. The elevator door closed behind me with a soft whoosh, and the elevator began its descent. As it moved downward, I noticed something strange. There was a slight, unsettling lurch to the motion. I felt a strange vibration under my feet, like the floor beneath me was shifting. My stomach churned as I glanced at the control panel. The numbers were lighting up in an odd sequence, not in the usual order. First, the 3rd floor lit up, then the 5th, then the 7th. I pressed the button for the basement and waited, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. My reflection in the elevator's glass wall seemed off, distorted, like a blur of motion in a still photo. The elevator stopped on the 5th floor. The doors opened with a soft chime, but the hallway outside was completely dark, not a single light on. The office was supposed to be empty, so why would it be so dark? I waited for a few moments, listening. There was no sound. Not even the hum of the air conditioning. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped out into the hallway. It was colder here, and the silence was suffocating. I turned down the corridor, feeling like something was watching me. But when I looked over my shoulder, the elevator was gone, the doors having silently closed behind me. Panic started to creep in, but I dismissed it. I was just being paranoid, I told myself. I walked toward the staircase leading to the basement, but when I reached the end of the hall, I froze. There was a door there that I knew had never been there before. A plain, unmarked door, slightly ajar. It shouldn't have been there, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I pushed the door open cautiously, peering inside. The room beyond was small, the walls covered with old, yellowed papers. It looked like an old storage closet, full of dust and forgotten things. But something was off. There was a heavy wooden box in the center of the room, and it was slightly ajar. A feeling of dread washed over me, but I couldn't look away from the box. It seemed like it was calling to me, its presence undeniable. As I approached it, the door behind me slammed shut with a loud bang. I jumped, my heart racing. I reached for the doorknob, but it wouldn't turn. It was locked. Then, the box shifted. I stood there, frozen in place, as the lid of the box creaked open slowly, revealing nothing but darkness inside. But as I peered into it, I felt a cold rush of air. It was like the temperature dropped in the room all at once, and for a moment, I thought I saw something, a flash of movement in the dark. A figure, or maybe a shadow, too quick for me to catch. The floor beneath me suddenly jolted, like the entire building had shifted. I stumbled back, heart pounding in my chest. The lights flickered overhead, casting strange, warped shadows across the walls. My pulse quickened as I rushed to the door again, slamming my shoulder against it, desperate to escape. The door burst open, and I nearly fell back into the hallway. I didn't care anymore. I ran, pounding up the stairs, racing past the elevator, ignoring the strange sounds that filled the air. It felt like the building itself was alive, like it was closing in around me. I reached the front doors and threw them open, stepping out into the cold night air, gasping for breath. My car was parked just a few steps away. I slammed the door shut behind me, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I drove home that night, never looking back. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of the morning, I still hear it, the faint, echoing sound of the floor shifting beneath me, as though the building itself remembers. The echoing silence. I hadn't meant to stay late at the office. But there I was, sitting in front of my computer, the only person left in the building. Everyone else had left hours ago, some for family dinners, some for drinks, but I had been buried in spreadsheets, trying to finish up a report that was due the next morning. It wasn't the first time I had stayed behind, but for some reason, tonight felt different. The building was quiet, too quiet. The hum of the fluorescent lights above my desk and the soft clack of my keyboard were the only sounds breaking the stillness. The coffee machine in the break room, which had long since run out of coffee, stood silent and empty. The faint ticking of the wall clock seemed louder, somehow, as if time itself was stretching out, slowing down. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone still sitting at their desk, but there was no one. Just the cold, empty offices, each one like a small, lifeless box, each one containing the ghosts of the people who had occupied them earlier. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the fatigue, and focused again on the screen. But then something caught my attention. It was the sound. At first, it was so faint that I thought I was imagining it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on a desk. I paused, staring at the screen, unsure if I had heard it. It stopped, and for a brief moment, there was nothing but silence again. I turned back to my work, telling myself it was just the building settling. Then it came again, this time louder. I looked around the office, my eyes scanning the darkened rows of cubicles. The sound was coming from somewhere behind me, near the supply closet at the far end of the floor. My stomach tightened as I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor in the stillness. I didn't like being alone in the office at night, but this felt different. It wasn't just the quiet. It was the way the quiet seemed to weigh on me, pressing down from all sides. I walked cautiously toward the back of the office, my shoes echoing against the polished floor. The lights above flickered, casting an eerie, uneven glow across the room. The supply closet door was slightly ajar, the light inside casting a thin, narrow strip of light into the hall. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door. The tapping had stopped, but I still felt something, a presence, just beyond the door. With a deep breath, I pushed it open. Nothing. The closet was empty, just rows of boxes, cleaning supplies, and some leftover office equipment. The air inside smelled stale, and the faint glow from the hall seemed out of place. I was about to turn and leave when I noticed something odd. There, on the floor in the far corner, was a small piece of paper. It wasn't something I'd seen before. I bent down to pick it up, the sensation of unease creeping up my spine. The paper was crumpled, but it seemed recent. It was a note, hastily written in black ink. "It's already too late." I blinked, reading the words over and over, trying to make sense of them. My heart began to race, the rhythm of my pulse in my ears louder than the sound of my breathing. I had no idea who could have written it, but my mind was already racing with possibilities, maybe a joke or something from one of the guys who worked late. But then again, I was the only one left in the office. The other employees had gone home hours ago. Suddenly, the lights above flickered again, and the entire floor plunged into darkness. I froze. For a long moment, I couldn't move. My eyes darted to the hallway, where only the emergency lights provided any illumination, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. I heard something, a soft shuffle, like someone moving around in the dark. I could feel my heart in my throat as I stood there, staring into the blackness, straining to hear any sign of movement. Then came the sound. A door creaked open. It was faint, but unmistakable. The faintest echo of something, or someone, on the other side of the building. My instincts told me to leave, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I could feel my body frozen in place, the fear weighing me down. And then, I heard it again, closer this time. A whisper. "Come here." It was a voice, soft, like someone calling from just beyond the shadows. It wasn't anyone I knew. It was a voice that sent a chill running through me, the kind of voice you hear in your nightmares, the kind that makes you want to turn and run but somehow keeps you rooted in place. I wanted to scream. I wanted to call out, but I couldn't. The fear was too much. I couldn't even move. The whisper came again, this time more insistent, urging me forward, pulling me toward the darkness. Slowly, I forced my legs to move, inching toward the source of the voice. My hands were trembling as I reached for the nearest office door, barely able to keep my breathing steady. The whisper was louder now, almost in my ear, like someone was standing right behind me. Just one step closer. The door opened on its own. I nearly stumbled backward, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. The door hadn't been opened when I passed it earlier. There was no one here. No one but me. Yet the door was now ajar, and the darkness beyond it seemed to pulse, like it was alive. I stepped inside. The office was pitch black. The windows were covered by heavy blinds, and the computer screens on the desks were dark. But there was something else. Something moving just at the edge of the darkness. A faint shadow. I could feel it, eyes on me, watching from the corner of the room. "You should have left earlier." The whisper came again, but this time it was clearer, more defined. I stumbled backward, my feet tingling as I tried to run. My hands reached for the door, but it slammed shut on its own, trapping me inside. And then I felt it, something cold, icy cold, pressing against my back. I whipped around, but the room was still empty. Only the darkness. The whisper stopped, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I don't remember much after that. The next thing I knew, I was outside, standing in the cold night air, my hands shaking, my heart still racing. The building was silent again, but I knew I wasn't alone. The Forgotten Hour. I had always been a night owl. It wasn't unusual for me to stay late at the library, especially during midterms when everyone else was cramming for exams. The hushed atmosphere, the smell of old books, and the flickering fluorescent lights were strangely comforting to me. But tonight, something was off. It was nearing midnight, and I was alone. The university library had long since closed to the public, and I was sitting at one of the farthest tables in the back corner, surrounded by towering bookshelves. The only sound was the soft turning of pages and the distant hum of the overhead lights. I could feel my eyelids growing heavier, the fatigue from a long day weighing on me. That's when I heard it. A low, almost imperceptible scratching sound coming from one of the bookshelves. I looked up, my heart skipping a beat. The shelf across from me was empty, as it had been for the last hour. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone else, maybe a fellow student still working late, but the library was as empty as it had been since closing time. The sound came again, this time louder, more insistent. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a mouse or some other harmless creature that had found its way into the building. I went back to my books, but the scratching grew louder. It sounded almost like nails running along the wood, deliberate and slow. My pulse quickened as I looked back up. And there it was. A book had fallen off the shelf. I didn't remember seeing it there before. It was an old, leather-bound book, one that seemed out of place among the modern academic texts. The cover was dark, almost black, with strange symbols etched into it. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I stared at it. But what made my blood run cold wasn't just the book, it was the fact that the shelf it had fallen from was now empty. All the books were gone. I had only been looking at it a moment ago, and they had been neatly stacked, just like the other shelves. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. The scratching had stopped, and the room felt unnervingly still. I walked toward the shelf, my footsteps echoing in the quiet library. As I reached for the book, a sudden cold breeze swept through the room, rustling the papers on my desk and sending a chill down my neck. The moment I touched the book, the lights flickered, once, then twice, and went out, plunging the library into darkness. I froze. There was no sound now, no hum of the lights, no movement at all. Just silence. My eyes strained in the pitch blackness, but I could see nothing. The darkness felt oppressive, like something was closing in on me, making it hard to breathe. I reached for my phone, but the screen was dead. No signal. That's when I heard it again, the scratching. This time, it was right behind me. I spun around, but the library was still empty, just rows upon rows of dark shelves. I felt a coldness brush past me, like a whisper of air, and I instinctively took a step back. My heartbeat quickened. Was someone else in here with me? But there was no one. The lights flickered back on, and I gasped as I saw a figure standing in the doorway at the far end of the library. It was a shadow, tall, thin, and featureless, but the air around it seemed to warp, like the very space was distorting. I couldn't move. The figure didn't move either, but it was there, in the doorway, just watching me. I felt the temperature drop, a cold, suffocating air that made it hard to breathe. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I backed away, my eyes never leaving the figure. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. The lights flickered again, this time longer, and when they came back on, the library was unchanged. But I knew something was wrong. The silence felt too complete, the air too thick. I bolted for the exit, but the door wouldn't open. I pulled and pulled at the handle, but it was locked. My phone was still dead, and the library was eerily still, as if it were holding its breath, waiting. I ran to the nearest window and pushed it open, but the moment I stepped closer, I saw it, my reflection in the glass. But it wasn't just me standing there. A figure stood behind me in the reflection, pale, with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched into a grin. My blood froze as I spun around, but no one was there. I ran out of the library into the cold night air, gasping for breath, my mind racing. I didn't stop until I was in the safety of my apartment. But as I lay in bed, wide awake, the memory of that figure lingered. And sometimes, when the room is too quiet, I hear the scratching again. The watcher in the dark. I didn't expect my routine walk home to take such a turn. It was a typical evening, the kind I'd walked 1,000 times before, down the same empty street, past the same row of dimly lit houses. The autumn air was crisp, and the fallen leaves crunched underfoot as I made my way home from work. I was tired, mentally drained, and all I wanted was to get back to the warmth of my apartment. It was just after 9 when I turned onto the quiet street that led to my building. The street lights hummed quietly, their yellow glow spilling onto the cracked pavement. There was no one else around. This part of the city was always peaceful at night, almost too peaceful. But tonight felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. At first, I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just the fatigue playing tricks on me, or maybe it was the rustling of the trees above, swaying in the light breeze. But the longer I walked, the more pronounced the sensation became. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone there, but the street was always empty. Until I reached the alley. The alley was a shortcut that led directly to my building's entrance. It was narrow, flanked on both sides by tall fences and old brick walls, and typically, no one would ever walk through it at night. I hesitated before stepping in, something about it seemed wrong tonight. But my apartment was just at the end of it, and I wasn't about to take the long way around. I stepped into the alley and walked briskly, trying to ignore the unease that had settled in my chest. But then I heard something, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and echoing behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickened my pace, trying to tell myself it was just someone else taking the same route. But the footsteps were following my every step, getting closer with every passing second. I spun around. The alley was empty. No one was there. But the footsteps, they kept coming. It was as if someone was walking just behind me, but no one was there. I could hear their breathing now, slow, measured, just like my own. I didn't dare stop to check behind me again. My body was on autopilot, moving as quickly as I could without breaking into a full sprint. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something. A shadow. It was a dark shape, standing still at the far end of the alley where the streetlight didn't reach. It was tall, too tall for a normal person, and unmoving. I could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, even though I couldn't see its details. I didn't want to look closer, but I couldn't stop myself. My feet were rooted to the ground as my gaze shifted back toward the shadow. It was as if it was watching me. That's when I heard it, a voice. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough for me to hear. Turn around. I froze. It was a whisper, soft but insistent, like it was right behind me, close enough to feel the heat of someone's breath on my neck. My stomach twisted in panic, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but I was paralyzed, my legs refusing to move. The shadow shifted. It moved slowly, deliberately, like a figure rising from the ground itself, stretching its form in a grotesque, unnatural way. My heart thudded in my chest, a deafening noise in my ears, and I knew I had to move, had to escape before whatever it was reached me. I ran. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, my breath ragged and uneven, my feet pounding against the pavement as I dashed out of the alley. The sound of footsteps was gone, but I knew it was still there, still following me. I didn't dare look back. When I reached the entrance of my building, I fumbled with my keys, my hands trembling. The door finally gave way, and I slammed it shut behind me, locking it quickly. I leaned against the door, gasping for air, my heart racing. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, telling myself it was just paranoia. But I couldn't ignore the fact that something was different, something wasn't right. The shadows in the hallway seemed deeper now, the corners darker than they should have been. I tried to convince myself that it was just the stress from work, that it had all been my imagination. But as I made my way to the elevator, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still watching me from just around the corner. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside, pressing the button for my floor. But just as the doors were about to close, a cold hand brushed against the back of my neck. I froze. There was no one else in the elevator. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The elevator was empty, except for the cold, oppressive air, thick with the presence of something that shouldn't have been there. The doors closed, and the elevator started to move. But as I looked up at the reflection in the mirrored walls, I saw it, a figure standing in the corner, just out of sight. The eyes. Hollow, dark, and endless. They were staring at me from the reflection. Watching. Waiting. The elevator stopped on my floor, and the door slid open. I didn't want to leave, but I had to. I had no choice. The presence was still there, lingering, like a shadow that refused to let go. I ran to my apartment, locked the door, and collapsed against it, my heart still racing. And then, the whispers began again. Soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent. You can't escape. The vanishing light. It was supposed to be a peaceful evening. I had just moved into a new apartment, a small, quiet unit on the edge of town. The building was old, but well maintained. There were only a few other tenants, mostly quiet professionals, or so I'd assumed. My apartment had that fresh paint smell, and I was looking forward to settling in and getting some much-needed rest after the long process of moving. That evening, I was unpacking the last of the boxes when I heard it, the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my door. Slow, deliberate steps. It wasn't the building settling, it was too regular. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting any visitors, and I didn't recognize the steps. I stood still for a moment, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I didn't want to be the nosy new neighbor, but curiosity got the better of me. I moved to the peephole and peered through. There was no one there. Just the dimly lit hallway, empty and still. A chill ran through me as I pulled away from the door. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, so it wasn't like people passed by constantly. I hadn't even seen anyone in the building so far. I tried to shake it off, thinking it might have been the neighbor or some random noise from the building itself. But the unease lingered. Later that evening, after a quick dinner, I decided to relax with a book in the living room. I switched on the lamp beside my couch, and the soft glow of the light filled the room, casting long shadows on the walls. Everything felt fine at first. But then, just as I was getting comfortable, the light flickered. It wasn't unusual for old buildings to have the occasional electrical issue. But the flicker wasn't just a quick blink, it lingered, dimming and brightening in a slow, uneven pattern. The room grew colder as I watched the lamp's light struggle to stay steady. I reached for the switch, but just as I was about to turn it off and back on, the light went completely out. Darkness. I cursed under my breath. Of course. I'd just moved in, and now I had to deal with this. I grabbed my phone to use its flashlight, but when I turned it on, the screen flickered. The light on the phone blinked like it was about to die. It wasn't. I checked the battery, full charge. I stood there in the oppressive darkness, my thoughts racing. Something felt wrong. I felt watched. I wasn't alone in this apartment, not anymore. My fingers tightened around the phone, and I considered just waiting it out. But then I heard it. A soft scraping sound, like fingers dragging slowly across wood. I froze. It was coming from the kitchen. I hadn't heard it before, but now that it was there, I couldn't ignore it. It wasn't the sound of a mouse or anything that could be explained easily. No, this was something deliberate, something that was waiting for me to hear it. I slowly walked towards the kitchen, my phone's flashlight barely lighting the way. Every step felt heavier, as if the air itself had thickened, pressing in on me. As I stepped into the kitchen, my light caught on something strange. The kitchen light was on. It wasn't the overhead light that had failed earlier. This was the small, dim light over the sink. And it was flickering in the same erratic pattern as the lamp had been earlier. I wasn't imagining it. I was sure of it now. There was something happening here. I backed away from the sink and turned to leave, but the scraping noise came again, closer this time, as if someone had stepped into the room with me. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. There was no one there. The kitchen was empty, just as it should be. But the air felt thick, heavy. And then, as I stood there in the silent kitchen, the light above the sink flickered once more, and then went out completely. I was left standing in the dark, with only the faint light from my phone illuminating the edges of the room. And that's when I heard it again, the scraping noise, this time unmistakable, coming from right behind me. I whipped around, the light from my phone shining into the empty space behind me, but there was nothing there. No one. My heart was racing now, pounding in my chest as my breaths became shallow. The apartment felt suffocating. The light flickered back on, but this time it was even dimmer. The shadows in the corners seemed darker than before, deeper, like they were closing in on me. I couldn't take it anymore. I rushed to the door, but when I tried to turn the handle, it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, but the door was stuck, as if something was holding it shut from the other side. That's when the phone light dimmed again, and I heard a voice. A whisper. Leave. I didn't hesitate. I shoved against the door with all my strength, but it refused to open. The voice came again, louder now, more insistent. Leave now. Panic surged through me. My mind raced with options, but none of them made sense. I had to get out. I had to escape whatever this was. I stepped back and charged at the door with my shoulder, throwing my entire weight into it. Finally, the door flew open and I stumbled out into the hallway. But the moment I crossed the threshold, I heard it scraping, dragging, like something moving just behind me. I didn't dare look back. I ran down the stairs, not stopping until I reached the street outside. My phone was still flickering, but the light now felt faint, almost useless. I didn't go back that night. I couldn't. Something had been waiting for me inside that apartment. Something that wasn't human. And as I stood outside in the cold, I heard it again. That whisper. You can't run from me. The last passenger. It was a late night when I boarded the last train home. I had just finished an exhausting week of work, and all I wanted was to relax in the comfort of my apartment. The train station was nearly empty, with only a handful of commuters scattered across the platform. A few tired faces staring blankly at their phones or newspapers, and one or two people chatting quietly among themselves. The usual late-night crowd, nothing unusual. The train arrived, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a cold blade. I stepped inside and took my seat by the window. The car was mostly empty, and the hum of the engine was the only sound. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to drown out the noise of my own thoughts. The train began its journey. The familiar rattling of the tracks was oddly soothing, and I could feel myself starting to relax. The journey would take about 30 minutes, just enough time to unwind before I got home. But then, about 10 minutes into the ride, I noticed something odd. The train stopped. It wasn't the usual scheduled stop. It was in the middle of nowhere, on a stretch of tracks I didn't recognize. There were no stations around, no lights in the distance, just pitch-black darkness outside the windows. For a moment, I thought the train had broken down, but the lights were still on and the air conditioning was still running. The train didn't feel like it had stalled, just that it had paused. I looked around. Most of the other passengers were still in their seats, but they didn't seem to be reacting. One woman, sitting a few rows ahead, stared blankly out the window, her face expressionless. Her eyes were wide open, but there was no sign of recognition or awareness in them. The more I looked at her, the more unsettling she became. Then I saw him. A man, standing by the door to the next car. He wasn't moving, just standing there with his back to me, facing the wall. He wore a dark coat, and his hair was messy, like he had been running through the rain. What struck me most was his complete stillness. It wasn't natural. People don't stand perfectly still like that unless they're waiting for something. Or someone. I tried to ignore him, but I couldn't help the feeling that something was off about him. It was like he was waiting. Waiting for me, or maybe for someone else. But then, just as I was about to glance away, I noticed something even more disturbing. The door between the cars slid open, and the man stepped through. But he didn't walk into the next car. He disappeared. Like he'd simply vanished into thin air. I blinked, convinced I had imagined it. But when I looked around, the woman was still staring at the window, and no one else seemed to have noticed. I stood up, a sense of unease creeping over me, and made my way to the door where the man had been standing. When I reached it, I pulled on the handle. It was locked. I knocked softly, hoping someone in the next car could explain the situation. But there was no response. I knocked again, harder this time, and the door rattled. That's when I heard it, footsteps. Slow, dragging footsteps. They echoed from behind the door, too loud to be ignored. My heart raced. I couldn't stay there. I turned away, but as I did, I caught a glimpse of something through the window of the next car. A figure, standing perfectly still in the aisle, just like the man had been earlier. But this time, it was closer. Much closer. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unwavering. I hurried back to my seat, my mind spinning with questions. What was happening? Why was the train stopped in the middle of nowhere? Who was that man? And why did he seem so familiar, like I had seen him somewhere before? Suddenly, the train jerked forward, as if someone had finally decided to start it again. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, everything went black. When the lights returned, the car was empty. Everyone had vanished. The woman who had been sitting in the row ahead was gone. The other passengers, the ones who had been there before, were nowhere to be seen. I was the only one left on the train. Panic surged in my chest as I sprinted to the nearest door, slamming my shoulder against it. It wouldn't budge. The train kept moving, the sound of the wheels grinding along the tracks the only thing I could hear. I ran to the front of the car, desperately searching for the conductor, but there was no one. The entire train was abandoned, except for me. I tried calling out, but my voice was swallowed by the eerie silence that seemed to hang in the air. That's when I realized something even worse. The train wasn't moving forward. It was moving backward. I could see it now. The tracks outside the window were leading back into the darkness, into a place I didn't recognize, a place that shouldn't exist. I could feel the weight of the air around me, heavy, oppressive, like the train was carrying me towards something I wasn't meant to understand. Then, I saw the man again. He was standing in the aisle, right in front of me. His face was still obscured, but I could feel the coldness radiating from him. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. He reached out, his hand coming toward me, and I backed away instinctively. The door to the car slid open, and I ran through it, desperate to escape, but there was no other exit. The train stretched on forever, winding its way deeper into the void. And the whispers started. You're the last one. You can't leave. The unseen passenger. It was a quiet Thursday evening when I took the bus home after work. Nothing special, just another routine journey. The city was bustling with the usual crowd, but as soon as I got on the bus, the world seemed to narrow down to just a few of us who were on board. I found a seat near the middle, near the window, and settled in for the ride. It was one of those city buses with the flickering lights. I never liked it when the lights would buzz, but that evening it seemed more pronounced. The hum of the bus's engine drowned out most of the city noise, and I found myself zoning out, letting my eyes drift across the cityscape. The bus wasn't crowded, just a few people scattered around, an older man sitting in the front, a young couple near the back, and a woman in the seat directly across from me. She was wearing a long coat, her face hidden behind dark sunglasses despite the late hour. I wondered briefly why anyone would wear sunglasses indoors, but I dismissed it. The bus lurched forward, making a stop at the next corner, but as it did, I noticed something strange. The older man near the front didn't get off when the doors opened. He didn't even look up from his seat. I frowned. It was unusual for someone not to get off at a scheduled stop, especially when they were sitting in the front. The bus had barely stopped, but I could see the man had no intention of leaving. I glanced at the driver. He was staring straight ahead, his face blank, like he hadn't even noticed the man's strange behavior. The bus continued on, but now I felt a growing unease. The woman across from me was still staring straight ahead, her sunglasses never moving, her posture unnaturally still. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and checked the time. It was nearly 9:30. I was still about 20 minutes from home, but the longer the ride went on, the more unsettled I became. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. At the next stop, the bus driver turned off the engine for a brief moment. It was a minor delay, he probably needed a rest, but I was already feeling tense, so the stillness made it worse. As we waited, I could hear a soft creaking noise coming from the back of the bus, almost like someone was shifting in their seat, but when I turned around, the young couple was still seated, talking quietly to each other. The bus moved again, and that's when it happened. The woman across from me, her sunglasses, her posture, everything about her had changed. She wasn't just sitting there anymore. She was leaning toward me, slowly, like she had been waiting for me to notice her. Her movement was so subtle, so gradual, that I didn't realize it until she was inches from my face. I froze. I couldn't look away from her. Her eyes were hidden behind those dark glasses, but I could feel her gaze piercing into me, deep into my very soul. My heart began to race, and I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. What did she want? The bus lurched again, this time more violently, throwing me off balance. I grabbed the seat in front of me to steady myself, and when I looked back at her, she was gone. I blinked, staring at the empty seat where she had been. My breath was shallow, my chest tight with panic. I quickly scanned the bus, but the woman was nowhere to be seen. Had I imagined it? But no, there was still a faint presence in the air, like the space around me had been disturbed. Something was wrong. I had seen her so clearly. I glanced at the other passengers. The older man was still seated in the front, his hands folded neatly on his lap. He hadn't moved. The young couple was still engrossed in their conversation, and yet something about their faces seemed off. The man's mouth didn't move as he spoke. His lips stayed perfectly still, even as words came out. The woman's eyes were fixed, staring at me. I was being watched. I could feel it now, the weight of their gaze pressing on me. I had to get off. As the bus rolled toward my stop, I stood up quickly, my legs shaky. But the moment I reached for the door handle, it jammed. I pulled again, but it was stuck. The driver didn't seem to notice. The door wouldn't open. I turned, feeling the cold sweat running down my back. Everyone on the bus was still there, frozen in place, not one of them even blinking. The young couple, the older man, they were all staring at me, unblinking. I tried to back away, but my foot caught on something. I looked down and saw it, a small, dark shadow on the floor, as though someone had dropped something there. But there was nothing there when I tried to bend down to look closer. And then, from the back of the bus, I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible above the hum of the engine. "You don't belong here." I turned back to the door, desperately trying to pry it open, but the handle was now cold, as if coated in ice. The whisper came again, louder this time, more insistent. "You will stay. You can't leave." The bus lurched again, and I was thrown off balance. The entire bus shook, and the lights flickered. And then, With a jarring stop, the bus went completely dark. For a moment, everything was pitch black, and I could hear only my own breathing. When the lights returned, I was the only one on the bus. The others were gone. All of them. The seats were empty, the air was still. I rushed to the door again, and this time it opened. I didn't think. I just ran. As soon as I stepped off the bus, the door slammed shut behind me. I turned around. The bus was gone, like it had never been there at all. The street was completely silent, and I was alone, standing in the dark. The city stretched out before me. But I could feel it, deep in my bones. I wasn't alone. I never took that bus again. The library in the dark. It wasn't until I heard the door behind me creak open that I thought to check the time. I hadn't seen anyone enter. I turned my head slightly, only to see that no one had walked in. The door was still wide open, but no one was standing in it. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The library was still and silent, with no sign of movement except for the dim light flickering above me. I tried to shake the unease and went back to my book. But the feeling didn't leave me. Something was off. The quiet sound of footsteps reached my ears, soft and deliberate, like someone was walking just behind me. I held my breath, listening closely. There was no one else near me. I was alone, wasn't I? I stood up, unnerved, and glanced at the other table. The person by the window was still there, but their head was tilted down, as though they were reading something intently. But even though their body was there, I couldn't shake the sensation that they weren't quite present. Their figure was faint, as though they were flickering between reality and something else. I took a deep breath and shook my head. It was probably nothing. Just my imagination. I started walking back toward the front desk when the lights above me flickered again, and for a split second, everything went completely dark. I froze. It lasted no more than a second, but when the lights came back on, the atmosphere had shifted. The library was darker now, and the air felt thicker, almost suffocating. The shelves were still in place, but the shadows between them seemed deeper, more alive. The footsteps had returned. This time, they were closer, louder, coming toward me. The sudden sound of a chair scraping across the floor made me flinch. I spun around, but no one was there. Then, from the far corner, I saw it. A book, lying open on the floor, was turning its pages by itself. The pages fluttered as if an invisible hand were flipping through them. My heart began to race. I couldn't take my eyes off it. I moved closer, hesitantly, my feet dragging against the cold tile floor. The pages stopped, suddenly. I could hear the faintest whisper. It wasn't words, just a soft rustling sound, like something in the book had come to life. I reached out to touch it, my fingers trembling. The moment they made contact with the pages, the room seemed to grow colder. My vision blurred for a split second, and I felt a strange pull, as though the book was drawing me in. The words on the page were no longer in any language I recognized. They squirmed, shifted, like something was moving beneath them. I tried to pull my hand away, but it wouldn't budge. I felt a tug on my wrist, a force pulling me closer to the book, forcing me to read its impossible text. I could hear the faint whispers again, growing louder, urging me to stay. Suddenly, the person at the table by the window stood up. Their movement was stiff, unnatural. They turned to face me, their eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. But there was something wrong with them. Their features were distorted, like a reflection in a cracked mirror. The eyes beneath the glasses were wide open, and their face didn't match the rest of their body. It looked stretched, like it didn't belong there. I couldn't move. The grip on my wrist tightened, pulling me toward the book. The whispers were deafening now, an inhuman chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere. I managed to pull my hand back, but the moment I did, the room shifted. The bookshelves, once orderly, now leaned inward, closing in on me. The walls began to pulse, like the building itself was alive, and the floor beneath me cracked open in places, revealing nothing but blackness. The figure at the table was moving toward me now, stepping closer with every second. Their footsteps were no longer soft. They were sharp, deliberate, and fast. The light above flickered again, and the temperature dropped. I could see my breath in the air. I turned and ran. The footsteps followed me, their rhythm matching mine. I couldn't see the figure anymore, but I could feel it, its presence closing in on me. The hallway stretched out before me, but it was never ending. The door to the main room was miles away, and the walls seemed to close in with each passing second. I reached the exit, and the door slammed shut in front of me, as if to mock my attempt to escape. I turned around. The figure had appeared again, standing in the doorway. Their eyes were wide open now, but there was no more face, only darkness. And as I backed away, the door behind me opened on its own. I was free to leave, but I knew it wouldn't be over. The library was no longer just a building, it was something else entirely. The book that had drawn me in was still there, waiting. And the whispers, they never stopped. The abandoned subway. It was well past midnight when I decided to take the subway home. I had been out with friends in the city, and I missed the last bus. The subway was always a little eerie at this hour, but I didn't mind it. I'd taken it countless times before. The usual flickering lights, the smell of stale air, the low hum of the trains, it was all part of the city's charm, or at least that's what I used to think. As I descended the stairs to the platform, I noticed it was unusually quiet. Usually, there would be a few other late-night commuters, even at this hour, but tonight the station felt empty. My footsteps echoed off the concrete walls, and I glanced around, noticing how the fluorescent lights above buzzed, flickering intermittently. I checked the schedule. The next train was supposed to arrive in 5 minutes, so I sat down on one of the benches, leaning back and pulling out my phone to pass the time. As I scrolled through my messages, I could hear the faint sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance. It was coming from deep within the tunnel, a rhythmic drip 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 that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The sound grew louder, but I couldn't see anything in the dark corners of the station. My phone's screen flickered for a moment, and then it was fine again. I put it away, glancing nervously at the tunnel entrance, where the flickering lights seemed to stretch further into the darkness. The train was late. That was unusual for this line, but I wasn't in a hurry. I glanced around the platform again, but there was no one else. No one but me, alone in the dim glow of the lights. And that's when I noticed it, the faint sound of footsteps. I stood up quickly, my heart racing. The footsteps were soft but deliberate, coming from the far end of the platform. I strained my ears, trying to make out who could be walking at this hour. But when I turned the corner, there was no one there. I stepped forward cautiously, my mind racing. Maybe it was someone just walking down the stairs, but I didn't see any sign of movement. The train was supposed to arrive soon, but the closer I got to the edge of the platform, the more uneasy I felt. Then, just as I was about to turn back to the bench, I heard it again. Footsteps, but not like before. These were different. Slow, shuffling steps, dragging along the floor. As if something was struggling to move. I froze. I couldn't see anyone, but the sound grew louder, closer. My breath caught in my throat. I glanced toward the tunnel again, feeling the tension in the air thickening. Something was wrong. There was no way that sound was coming from a person. The train's headlights flickered in the distance, but instead of the usual rhythmic sound of the train's arrival, there was something else. A loud, metallic screech, as if the train's brakes were being dragged across the tracks. I could see the faint shadow of the train creeping closer, but it wasn't moving at its usual speed. It was crawling, like something was pulling it, or like it was being forced against its will. The train arrived, but something about it wasn't right. The doors didn't open immediately like they usually did. There was a long pause, and the screeching sound grew louder, like something was stuck in the gears of the train, something grinding against the metal. I stepped forward, but my legs were heavy, like they didn't want to move. The footsteps were now right behind me, a low, dragging sound, as if something was following me from the tunnel. I turned around, but there was no one. Only the darkness, stretching into the depths of the station. Finally, the doors of the train opened, but as I stepped inside, I felt a cold chill, as though I had entered a completely different world. The interior of the train was darker than usual, the lights dimmer, and the seats were empty. There was no one else inside. The doors slid shut behind me with a heavy thud, and I felt a sudden, intense pressure in the air, like something was closing in on me. I grabbed the nearest pole for support as the train jolted forward. The sound of dragging footsteps was gone, but now there was a new sound, low, almost imperceptible whispers, coming from the seats around me. I glanced quickly at the windows, but they were too dark to see anything. Then I heard it again. A voice. Clear, but distant, like it was coming from the other end of the car. Get off. The words echoed in the silence of the train. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure whether I had heard it right. I looked around, but there was no one in the train car. Just me. Alone. The train sped up suddenly, faster than usual, and I could feel the pressure on my chest increasing. The whispers were getting louder, more frantic. Get off. It's too late. I started to move toward the door, but the train jerked again, throwing me off balance. I stumbled, and when I regained my footing, the doors to the next car slid open on their own. I stepped through them without thinking, and the moment I did, I realized my mistake. The next car wasn't like the others. It was completely dark. Pitch black. I couldn't see a thing. I reached out blindly, but I felt nothing. No walls, no seats, no poles to hold on to. And then I heard the sound of breathing. Slow. Heavy. Right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. Just darkness. The train screeched to a halt, and I was thrown against the wall of the car. The doors opened with a jolt, and I had no choice but to stumble out into the tunnel. The platform was empty now. No lights. No sounds. Just the echoes of my own footsteps. I ran, not looking back, but the whispers followed me, getting louder with every step. It's too late. Too late to leave. The the hollow night. I had been driving for hours. The streets were empty, and the only light came from the headlights of my car, casting long shadows on the empty road. I'd taken the back roads to avoid the highway traffic, and now it was too late to turn back. The GPS was showing I'd be in town in another half hour, but the further I went, the more unsettled I felt. The trees on either side of the road seemed to close in, their bare branches reaching out like twisted hands. The air felt unnaturally still, like the world was holding its breath. I shook my head, trying to shake off the strange sensation that had settled over me. It was just my imagination, I told myself. I was tired, and the road was long. As I continued driving, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I slammed on the brakes, nearly swerving off the road. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked out the window. There, just beyond the trees, I saw a figure standing still in the dark, too still. It was a person, dressed in dark clothes, facing the woods. But the way they stood, it was wrong. Too rigid. They didn't move at all, not even to acknowledge my car. I tried to ignore the creeping dread in my stomach and accelerated, the engine roaring to life again as I sped down the road. But my mind couldn't stop racing. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure following me, but there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of road and the trees on either side. Minutes passed, and the eerie quiet returned. It felt like I was in a vacuum, the world outside my car forgotten. Then I saw it, the sign for the next town, lit by a single, flickering street lamp. I let out a sigh of relief. Almost there. But then, something strange happened. As I passed under the street lamp, I saw a reflection in the corner of my eye. For a split second, I thought I saw someone in the back seat. I whipped my head around, my breath catching in my throat. But the back seat was empty. I was alone. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt the urge to look over my shoulder again, but I didn't dare. The unsettling feeling had returned, this time deeper, more suffocating. It was like something was watching me, not from outside the car, but from within it. I pulled into the town, my car's tires crunching on the gravel. The streets were deserted, and the dim streetlights cast long, jagged shadows across the pavement. It was like a ghost town, silent and abandoned. I wasn't sure what I expected, but it certainly wasn't this. The first building I passed was a small, run-down convenience store. Its neon sign flickered erratically, casting strange blue lights over the empty road. I glanced at the front window as I drove by and froze. A shadow moved inside the store. I stopped the car abruptly, my hand shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I had seen it clearly. Someone was standing in the dark interior of the store, watching me. The figure didn't move, but I could feel their gaze piercing through the window. I turned the engine off, the silence of the car settling in around me. Should I go inside? Should I keep driving? I hesitated. But curiosity won out, and I opened the car door, stepping out into the cold night air. My boots crunched on the gravel as I approached the store, my heart pounding harder with each step. The bell above the door jingled as I pushed it open, but as I entered, the overwhelming stillness hit me. The store was empty. No one was inside. No shelves, no aisles, just the cold, metallic air and the sense that something wasn't right. I turned back to leave, but before I could take another step, I heard a noise behind me. The softest whisper. "Leave now." I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the empty, silent store. The whisper had come from nowhere, or maybe from everywhere. My heart raced and panic surged through me. The door slammed shut and I turned back, but the shelves were full now, full of something I hadn't noticed before. The walls of the store had shifted. There was no longer a clear path to the exit. It was like the layout of the store had changed, as if it had folded in on itself. The shelves were stacked impossibly high, crammed with old, decaying items. Broken bottles. Torn newspapers. Strange, discarded objects I couldn't even recognize. And then, I saw something else, a figure, standing at the far corner of the store. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. The whispering returned, louder now. You should have left when you had the chance. I backed up slowly, my breath shallow, as I tried to find the door. But no matter how far I walked, it felt like I was just going deeper into the store, into the maze of shelves and debris. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it following me. I could hear it breathing, slow and deep, just behind me. Then, the lights above me flickered and went out completely. I was plunged into darkness, the air growing heavier, colder. My mind raced. There was no way out. I could hear the whispering now, surrounding me. There was no one there, but I felt like I wasn't alone. The darkness closed in, pressing against me, suffocating me. Stay with us. The voice was close. Too close. I whirled around, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence of the dark store. I ran, but my feet seemed to move slower and slower, as if the store itself was trying to pull me back, to keep me trapped. And then I felt it, a hand, cold and damp, brush against my arm. I screamed, but no sound came out. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my car, sitting in the driver's seat, the engine running. The town was gone, replaced by the empty stretch of road I had been driving down earlier. The car was moving, but I had no memory of starting the engine, of anything that had happened after I entered the store. I looked at my hands. There was dirt on them, and a thin smear of something wet, dark. I couldn't breathe. I didn't know where I was, or how I had gotten there, but the feeling that I was being watched never left me. I never saw the store again. The whispers in the hallway. I was staying in my friend's apartment for the weekend. It was a quiet, two-bedroom place in a building that looked like it was from the 70s, with old wooden floors and faded wallpaper. The moment I stepped inside, I felt a strange calm, familiar, but with an underlying layer of something I couldn't quite place. My friend was away for the weekend, leaving me alone to relax and unwind. The apartment was on the 4th floor, and from the balcony, I could see a small, quiet park with trees that looked like they hadn't been trimmed in years. It was peaceful, too peaceful. There was something almost unnervingly still about the entire place. As I unpacked, I noticed the hallway outside seemed oddly narrow, the light dimmer than I expected, and there was an old, rusted mirror that hung crookedly on the wall just outside the bathroom. I didn't think much of it at first. My friend had always been a bit of a collector of odd things. After a few hours of binge watching a show, I decided to get some fresh air. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside onto the balcony. The night had fallen, and the streets below were almost completely empty. I wasn't used to such quiet. It was as though the whole city had fallen asleep, save for a few scattered streetlights and the distant hum of cars. I leaned over the railing and sighed. It felt good to be away from the usual noise. That's when I heard it, a soft, distant sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. It was faint, almost like someone whispering. I straightened up, glancing down the hallway that ran outside the living room. The sound was coming from there, faint but unmistakable. It was a low murmur, like voices in the walls. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as my imagination. But it persisted, growing clearer, the words beginning to form. I couldn't make them out, but I felt a cold chill creep down my spine. Slowly, I moved toward the hallway, my heart beating faster. The apartment was small, only a few rooms, but the hallway seemed endless in the silence. The whispering grew louder, but now it wasn't just coming from the walls. It was coming from somewhere deeper, inside the hallway itself. I crept forward, my feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. As I passed the crooked mirror, I stopped and looked into it. For a split second, I thought I saw something move in the reflection, something that wasn't there when I turned around. A figure, dark and shifting, just out of the corner of my eye. I jumped back, my breath caught in my throat. The whispering stopped. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that I was just overtired, that my nerves were getting the best of me. But something was off. Something wasn't right. The air felt heavier now, pressing against my chest. I turned and quickly made my way back to the living room, trying to push the unease away. But then, as I passed the hallway once more, I heard it again, this time clearer than ever. "Come closer." I froze. The voice sounded so close, like it was right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. The hallway was empty. My pulse was hammering in my ears as I backed up, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Suddenly, the light in the hallway flickered, and I swore I saw the shadow of something moving in the dark. It wasn't a person. It was too tall, too thin. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. My legs felt heavy, as if they were sinking into the floor. "Come closer," the voice whispered again, this time from directly in front of me. I felt a cold breath against my ear, and I spun around so fast, I almost lost my balance. The hallway was still empty, but the oppressive feeling in the air was unbearable now. It felt like the walls were closing in, like something was watching me from the other side of the mirror, from the shadows, from the very walls themselves. Without thinking, I turned and bolted out of the apartment. I didn't even grab my coat. I ran down the hallway, past the crooked mirror, past the empty rooms. When I reached the stairs, I stopped, my heart racing. I couldn't breathe. There was something about the apartment. It was as if it had always been waiting for someone to notice it, to hear the whispers in the walls. But I didn't want to hear any more. I didn't want to feel the cold, the pressure. As I descended the stairs to the first floor, I glanced back toward the door at the top of the landing. The apartment door was wide open. I never returned to that apartment. The forgotten door. I was running late, as usual. It had been one of those days where everything felt off, meetings stretched on longer than expected, and I was just too tired to care. I needed to pick up some groceries before heading home, so I stopped by a small, local store near my apartment. It was one of those places I'd passed by dozens of times, never thinking much about it. The kind of place with a faded neon sign and old-fashioned wooden shelves. I didn't even know its name. The store was quiet, as expected for a late afternoon. A few people milled about, and the aisles were lined with products that looked like they hadn't been updated in years. I grabbed a cart and started making my way through the store, picking up a few essentials: eggs, milk, bread. Everything felt normal, but there was a lingering sense of unease. It wasn't the store itself, but more of a feeling in the air, like something wasn't quite right. I chalked it up to exhaustion. As I turned into an aisle near the back, I saw something strange. There, at the end of the row, was a door. I had walked through this aisle before, and I knew there hadn't been a door there. I blinked and took a step forward, narrowing my eyes. It was an old wooden door, the kind that looked like it belonged in a house more than a store. There was no sign indicating it led anywhere, no handles or labels. Just a plain, unmarked door at the end of a grocery aisle. I felt an odd pull toward it. There was something strangely inviting about the door. Maybe it was the fact that it was so out of place, or maybe it was because it looked like it had been forgotten, hidden away like a secret. My curiosity got the better of me, and I walked toward it, even though I knew it was probably just an old storage room or something boring. But as I reached for the handle, I hesitated. There was a faint buzzing sound coming from the other side of the door, like electricity running through wires. It was subtle but present. I shook my head, dismissing it as nothing, and turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a dark room beyond. It was pitch black inside, no lights, nothing to indicate what lay beyond. I couldn't even make out the walls. The room felt wrong. It was colder than the rest of the store, a deep, unnatural cold that seemed to seep into my skin. But what struck me most was the smell. It was metallic, like blood, mixed with something sour, something old. I couldn't place it, but it made my stomach turn. I took a step inside, the door swinging shut behind me with a soft thud. My heart raced. I had no idea why I was still standing there. Something told me to turn around, to leave, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I took another step, my breath shallow, and then another, until I was fully inside the room. The buzzing sound was louder now, like it was coming from the walls. It felt like the walls were vibrating. I reached out for something, anything to steady myself, but there was nothing to grab. That's when I heard it. A voice. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. A low, guttural whisper, almost like a growl, that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. You shouldn't have come in. I froze. The voice wasn't human. It was something deeper, older, filled with malice. My heart pounded in my chest, and I took an instinctive step back, but the room seemed to stretch, pulling me further in. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, the air growing heavier with every breath I took. I spun around, looking for the door, but it was gone. There was no door anymore. Just endless, swirling darkness. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, feeling for the walls. My fingers brushed something cold and wet, and I recoiled, a shiver crawling up my spine. There was something there, something I couldn't see, but I could feel it. It was waiting. Then, the voice came again, clearer this time. Leave now, or you will stay forever. I turned to run, but the room seemed to twist, stretching in impossible directions. I could hear my footsteps echoing, but they sounded distant, like someone else was walking behind me. My breath was ragged as I tried to find the door, my hands scraping against the walls, my mind spinning with terror. It felt like hours, though it was only moments, and then, just as I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw the door again. It was just there, standing wide open, waiting for me. I ran toward it, but as I reached the threshold, I felt something grab my ankle, pulling me back. I screamed, but my voice didn't escape. The air was thick now, suffocating. My mind raced, and I dug my nails into the floor, trying to break free, but whatever had a hold of me was too strong. Suddenly, everything stopped. The room was still. The buzzing faded. The pull on my ankle released, and I found myself standing at the entrance of the store once more. The aisle was quiet. The door was gone. My heart was racing as I stood frozen in place, trying to process what had just happened. I looked around, but no one seemed to notice. The store was exactly as it had been when I first entered, calm, normal. I blinked and took a deep breath, unsure if I had imagined it all. I left quickly, paying for my groceries with shaky hands. But when I stepped outside, I glanced back one last time at the building. And there, in the window, I saw it. The faint outline of the door. And behind it, something moving, something that wasn't human. I never went back to that store. The long ride home. It had been a long, exhausting day. I had just wrapped up a work trip, and all I wanted was to get home. The flight had been delayed, the cab ride was longer than expected, and now I was stuck in traffic on a poorly lit highway, surrounded by nothing but dark fields on either side. The only thing keeping me company was the steady hum of the car's engine and the radio, which was playing some forgotten tune I didn't care to remember. It was one of those quiet nights when the world felt too still, and the darkness outside seemed to stretch on endlessly. The road was desolate, a stretch of rural highway with no lights and barely any other vehicles. I couldn't even remember the last time I passed another car. I should have taken the other route, the one that went through the city, but I was already so far into this one. A part of me wanted to just get home as quickly as possible. But then, out of nowhere, my headlights caught something in the distance, a figure standing by the side of the road. It was strange because I hadn't seen a single person for miles. I slowed the car down instinctively, my heart rate quickening as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure didn't seem to be moving, just standing there, barely visible in the darkness. I couldn't make out any details at first, just a vague silhouette, but then I saw it, a man, or at least I thought it was a man. He wore a long coat, his face obscured by the hood. There was something wrong about him, though. The way he stood there, perfectly still, like he wasn't even breathing, made my stomach turn. I debated whether to stop. I wasn't sure why I even considered it, but something inside me told me to pull over. I rolled the window down just a crack, trying to get a better look at him. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper against the rush of wind. The figure didn't respond. He just stood there, his head slightly tilted, as if he were listening. His silence was unnerving. After a moment, I began to feel uncomfortable, like he was staring right at me even though I couldn't see his face. I reached for the door handle, intending to drive off, when I saw something that froze me in place. There was another figure, just a few feet behind him. The second figure was even more unnerving, tall, gaunt, and covered in what looked like tattered clothing. The way it stood there, hunched over, with its long, thin fingers reaching toward the car, sent a chill down my spine. I slammed the car into reverse, heart pounding. My hands shook as I stepped on the gas, the tires screeching against the pavement. The figures didn't move, they just remained standing there, staring at me, their shapes growing smaller in my rearview mirror. But as I glanced in the mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The second figure was closer now, moving toward the car at an impossible speed, like it was gliding, its limbs twitching unnaturally. I gasped and turned forward, pressing the gas pedal harder, trying to put distance between myself and whatever that thing was. As I sped down the highway, the dark fields blurred into a black void around me, and I kept glancing back, watching the figures fade into the distance. I could hear my heart thundering in my ears, but there was something more. I could hear another sound now, a soft thud-thud, like footsteps following me. I glanced at the rearview mirror again. Nothing. The road behind me was empty. I exhaled in relief, but the sensation of being watched never left. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was just exhaustion, the stress of the trip, or the isolation of the road playing tricks on me. But then, the car suddenly jerked. It was a strange feeling, like something had slammed into the rear of the car. I swerved a little but regained control, my mind racing with thoughts of what had just happened. There was no other car on the road, no reason for the bump, and yet something felt very wrong. I checked my mirrors again. The second figure was there, closer than ever, its long arms stretched out, as though it were trying to catch up. My foot hit the gas pedal harder, but the engine sputtered, its power fading. It didn't make sense. This car had always run perfectly. I had just had it serviced. The sound of footsteps was getting louder, pounding against the ground like the rhythm of a heartbeat. I could feel a presence closing in. Finally, the car sputtered one last time and stalled. The headlights flickered and went out. It was pitch black. Panic surged through me. I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling. My breath came in short, desperate gasps. The footsteps were too close now, too close to ignore. I could hear them outside my door, the soft scrape of shoes on the pavement. There was no doubt in my mind, something was there. Something was trying to get in. I took a deep breath, my body frozen with fear, and reached for the door handle, determined to run. But before I could even turn the handle, I heard the voice. "Get out." It was a voice, clear and cold, coming from the back of the car. But it wasn't like a person speaking. It was wrong. It wasn't human. It was low, guttural, and filled with malice. I looked through the rearview mirror. In the reflection, I saw him no longer standing at the side of the road, but sitting in the back seat of the car. His face was pale, his eyes wide and hollow, and his mouth stretched into a grin that was far too wide. Before I could react, I heard the sound of the door handle slowly turning. My hands went numb as I realized he was already inside. The last train. It was late, the kind of night where everything felt muted, like the world was holding its breath. I had missed the last bus home, and the only way back was by train. The station was quiet, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above. I had been here countless times, so many nights like this, but something about tonight felt different. There was an eerie calm, a stillness that seemed to stretch on forever. I glanced around, but the only other people in the station were a couple of travelers sitting on a bench, looking as tired as I felt. The train was scheduled to arrive in 15 minutes, so I took a seat by the window, my eyes drifting to the tracks. I could see the distant glow of the train's headlights, but it felt like the darkness between the station and the tracks was holding something back, something I couldn't quite place. I tried to shake off the growing unease. It was just the late hour, I told myself. Maybe the station just looked creepier when it was empty. But there was something about the way the shadows stretched across the platform, the way the air felt heavier than usual, that made me uneasy. I could hear the soft tapping of my shoes against the floor, the only sound in the otherwise silent space. As I looked at the clock, I noticed the time had changed. It was still supposed to be 15 minutes until the train arrived, yet the clock now showed it would be arriving in 30 minutes. I frowned, checking my phone. The app still said the train would be here soon. I looked around the station. No one seemed to notice the change, but my stomach twisted. I had been here before. I knew the routine. The trains were always on time. I looked back at the platform, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing in the shadows at the far end where the tracks curved out of sight. I couldn't make out any details at first, just a silhouette, but I could feel the presence there, like something was watching me. I stared, trying to see if it was a person waiting for the train, but they didn't move. They were just standing there, perfectly still. My heart started to race, and I shifted uneasily in my seat, glancing at the clock again. The time had changed again. Now it showed the train would arrive in 20 minutes. It was like the minutes were stretching, like time itself was warping. I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear the exhaustion that had settled in. But when I looked back at the figure, it had moved closer. I hadn't heard footsteps, but the silhouette was unmistakably closer to the edge of the platform now. I stood up abruptly, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread that was pooling in my stomach. I walked toward the ticket booth, hoping for something to distract me, but the attendant was gone. The booth was empty. I glanced back at the tracks, my eyes instinctively drawn to the figure, but it was no longer in the same spot. It was closer again. Too close. My chest tightened, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I turned quickly and walked to the edge of the platform, hoping to get a better view of the train. But the tracks were empty. No train in sight. I checked the time. The clock still read that the train was due in 20 minutes. My phone said the same. Yet the platform was so empty, so silent, save for the distant sound of a train whistle. Then the figure moved again. I saw it in the corner of my eye, walking slowly down the tracks, its silhouette becoming clearer in the dim light. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with long arms that hung at its sides like they were too long for its body. The closer it got, the more unsettling it became. I could see its features now. Its face was pale, blank, with deep, hollow eyes. No mouth. No expression. Just the hollow emptiness of its gaze. The air around me grew colder. I could see my breath in front of me, even though it hadn't been cold before. My heart thudded in my chest as I took a step back. The figure was too close now. It was moving faster, its limbs jerking unnaturally, like it was glitching through the space between the tracks. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I didn't dare to look at it directly. I started to back away, my pulse racing. I needed to get out of there. But as I turned, the lights flickered, and the platform suddenly went dark. The buzz of the lights faded into nothingness, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I couldn't hear the trains anymore. The station felt like it had been swallowed by the dark. In the pitch black, I heard something else. The sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, just behind me. I dared not look, but I could feel it drawing closer. The sound was growing louder, too close for comfort. I broke into a run, adrenaline surging through my veins as I sprinted down the empty platform, the echo of my footsteps following me. I needed to get out, but the train was nowhere in sight. I didn't care. I just needed to leave. Suddenly, the lights flashed back on, and I found myself standing at the edge of the platform, gasping for breath. The figure was gone. The station was still. The time on the clock had reset. It was now showing that the train would arrive in 5 minutes, as if nothing had happened. I didn't wait for the train. I didn't care to check the time again. I ran out of the station, my heart still racing, and I didn't look back. But even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the echo of those footsteps. The Silent Library. It was a quiet Wednesday evening, and I had decided to spend a few hours in the library before heading home. The place was nearly empty, just a few other students scattered around, absorbed in their books. I made my way to the back, where the older books were kept. I liked it back there. It was isolated, the shelves lined with dusty volumes that no one ever seemed to check out. It was the kind of place where time felt like it stopped, where the quiet could almost swallow you whole. I took my usual seat by the window, the low hum of the air conditioning keeping the room at an almost chilly temperature. I opened my laptop, trying to get through some notes for an upcoming exam, but my mind kept wandering. The silence around me was thick, almost suffocating. There was something unsettling about it, a stillness that felt wrong. It was as if the library itself was holding its breath. I glanced around, noticing that the few other students who were there had all disappeared. It was strange, considering how busy the library had been when I first walked in. The shelves were still full, the faint rustling of pages the only sound in the otherwise dead air. I decided to ignore it and continue working, but the feeling of being watched crept over me. It wasn't just the usual sensation you get when you think someone is looking at you, it was something heavier, more intrusive. Then, I heard it. The faintest sound of footsteps. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it echoed in the silence. I froze, my eyes darting around the room. The aisles between the bookshelves were dark, the lights above flickering intermittently. There was no one there, no one I could see. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the building settling, or maybe a janitor somewhere. But the footsteps continued. Slow, deliberate steps, moving in my direction. They grew louder, but the odd thing was, I couldn't see anyone. The aisles remained empty. My heart began to race, and I forced myself to focus on my screen, trying to block out the noise. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were right there, too close for comfort. I stood up, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. My instinct was to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I glanced around the shelves again, my eyes scanning every corner. I thought I saw a shadow move, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. But when I looked directly at it, there was nothing. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I quickly packed up my things, making my way toward the exit. But the footsteps had changed. They were no longer slow. They were rushing toward me, quick, sharp. My breathing became shallow, panic rising in my chest as I turned toward the doors. I was almost there, just a few steps away from safety, when the lights above me flickered again and everything went dark. For a moment, I stood frozen, my pulse hammering in my ears. It was pitch black, the kind of darkness that felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in around me. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to use the flashlight, but when I turned it on, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the faint glow of my phone's light, I could see a figure standing at the end of the aisle, its face obscured by shadows. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and it stood perfectly still, just watching me. Its clothes were old-fashioned, something out of a different time. There was no movement, no sound, just the feeling that it was there, waiting. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The figure didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence growing closer, a weight pressing down on the air around me. I swallowed hard, my breath coming in quick gasps. The footsteps started again, but they weren't behind me anymore. They were all around me. I turned to look for the exit, but the room felt different now, larger, darker, as if the space itself had shifted. I felt a sudden pressure in my chest, like the walls were closing in. My phone flickered in my hand, casting strange, uneven shadows on the shelves. I backed away from the figure, my feet stumbling over the floor, but it didn't move. It just stood there, its eyes hidden in the darkness. I finally broke free, running toward the exit with everything I had. But as I reached the door, it slammed shut in front of me. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The library was closing in on me, the silence overwhelming. Suddenly, a voice broke through the stillness, a whisper, faint but clear. "You're not leaving." I spun around, but there was no one there. The figure, whatever it was, had vanished. The doors opened behind me with a loud creak, and I bolted out of the library, not daring to look back. My heart pounded as I stood outside in the cold night air, trying to catch my breath. The lights inside the library flickered back on, and everything seemed normal again. The library was empty, quiet as it had been when I first walked in. But as I glanced at the door, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. A small note, written in neat handwriting, taped to the glass. "You were never meant to leave." The vanishing reflection. I had always been the kind of person who enjoyed the quiet moments, especially during my late-night walks through the city. There was something calming about the stillness, the dim glow of streetlights casting long shadows across the empty roads. On this particular night, I decided to take a different route home, one that led me past an old, unused building. It had been abandoned for years, its windows boarded up, and the brick walls were covered in graffiti. No one ever paid attention to it, but it had a certain allure, something about it seemed off. Still, I didn't think much of it. The streets were unusually empty, and the silence felt almost suffocating. I walked briskly, trying to get to my apartment as quickly as possible. As I passed the old building, I happened to glance at one of the windows, which was cracked open just slightly. For a moment, I thought I saw something inside. A figure, perhaps. But when I blinked and looked again, the window was completely dark, and there was nothing. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Still, I quickened my pace, eager to put the eerie building behind me. But then I heard it. A faint sound, like the scrape of something against glass. I turned around instinctively, but there was no one in sight. The street was deserted, as it had been all evening. I stood there for a moment, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise, then shook my head and continued walking. A few steps down the road, I found myself inexplicably drawn back to the building. The sensation of being watched was growing stronger with every step I took. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like something was pulling me toward it, something I couldn't resist. I walked closer to the building, my feet moving on their own accord, and that's when I saw it again, the reflection of a person in the glass. Only this time, I could see it clearly. It was me, but not quite. The reflection of myself in the window was standing still, frozen, while I was still moving, my feet shifting, my body continuing to walk down the street. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding. I had seen myself reflected in windows countless times before, but this was different. My reflection wasn't moving with me. It stood there, staring back at me, unmoving, as if it was waiting for something. The air around me seemed to grow colder, and I felt a chill seep into my bones. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the window, from the reflection of myself that wasn't me. It was like it was staring into my soul, studying me. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. Suddenly, the reflection moved. It didn't mimic my movements, it did something else entirely. My reflection in the window raised its hand and pressed it against the glass, its fingers splayed wide as if it were trying to reach out. I gasped, taking a step back, my breath catching in my throat. I tried to call out, but no sound escaped my lips. The reflection was now pressing harder against the glass, its face contorted into an expression of fear. No, not fear. It looked like it was begging me for something, its wide eyes pleading with me, but I couldn't understand why. My legs were shaking, but my body refused to move. I was paralyzed, my feet glued to the pavement. My reflection's hand was still pressed against the glass, but now it seemed to be pulling, as though trying to escape from the window. I could feel something, no, someone, inside that window. And it wasn't me. The air became heavier, and the reflection began to distort. It started to flicker like a broken television screen, the image twisting and warping. I watched, unable to move, as my reflection's face became more and more distorted, its features blurring into something else, something inhuman. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the reflection stopped. Everything went still again. The reflection of me was gone, replaced by an empty window. No more figure. No more movement. I turned around, my heart racing. The street was still empty. The buildings around me loomed large and silent. I took a step backward, my breath ragged, still unsure if I had imagined the whole thing. But when I looked down, I saw something that made my stomach twist with dread. My hand was pressed against the side of the building, the very same position that my reflection had held. I jerked my hand away, stumbling backward, my breath catching in my throat. No, this couldn't be happening. I glanced up at the window once more, but this time there was nothing but darkness. No reflection. No movement. Just an empty glass. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the pavement, the sound of my breath echoing in my ears. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But as I turned the corner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something just beyond the corner of my vision. And as I reached my apartment building, I saw the reflection of a figure standing in the darkened window of the old building, staring at me. It was me, but not quite. The broken radio. It was late when I arrived at my grandmother's house. She had passed away the previous year, and I had been tasked with clearing out the place. The house was old, with creaky floors and dusty shelves that hadn't been touched in years. My parents had already gone to bed, leaving me alone with the quiet of the house. I hadn't planned to stay long, just long enough to grab a few things and head back to the city. But as I moved through the house, I felt a strange unease settle in. The air was thick with silence, and the faint smell of mothballs lingered in the corners. I was in the living room, sorting through some old books, when I noticed something strange. On the shelf beside me, an old radio sat, its wood tarnished and worn, a relic of a bygone era. My grandmother had always been a fan of old things, vintage trinkets, antiques, and things that seemed out of place in modern times. I had seen the radio many times before, but for some reason, tonight, it caught my attention. I didn't think much of it, but on impulse, I pressed the dial and turned it on. At first, all I heard was static, white noise that hummed in the air like the faint buzz of 1,000 bees. I twisted the dial, hoping to find a station, but nothing came through. The static remained. I thought about turning it off, but the longer I listened, the more something about the sound started to feel wrong. It wasn't just static, it was like a whisper, faint at first, but unmistakably there. I leaned closer to the radio, my heart thudding in my chest. The whisper grew louder, though still unintelligible, as if someone was speaking in a language I couldn't quite place. The sound seemed to come from all around me, not just the radio itself. I turned the dial again, hoping to find something, anything, that would make sense of the noise. As I twisted it, the whispers grew more distinct, but the words didn't make sense. It was like a jumble of syllables, eerie and nonsensical, too distorted to make out. Then, as I clicked the dial past a certain point, the sound abruptly stopped. The silence was deafening. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, and for a moment, I thought it was over. But then the radio crackled, and a voice came through. It was my grandmother's voice. I froze, my blood running cold. The words were soft, like she was trying to speak to me from a great distance. "Come closer." I didn't move. The voice wasn't right. It was distorted, faint, but unmistakable. She had passed away over a year ago, and hearing her voice, especially under such strange circumstances, sent a wave of dread rushing over me. "Come closer," the voice repeated, this time more insistent, almost pleading. I wanted to turn it off, to leave the room and pretend I hadn't heard it, but something compelled me to stay. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the way her voice sounded, so familiar yet so wrong. I leaned closer to the radio, my hand trembling as I reached for the dial to adjust it, but before I could touch it, the radio crackled once more. This time, it wasn't my grandmother's voice. "Don't listen." The voice was lower, deeper, and it felt like it came from inside the room rather than the radio itself. It echoed through the walls, vibrating in my bones. My heart raced, my instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet felt heavy, as though they were stuck to the floor. I pulled my hand away from the radio, but the voice didn't stop. It came again, louder, almost as if it was right next to me. "You shouldn't have come." Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the room felt colder. I could see my breath in the air. Panic surged through me. I grabbed the radio, my hand shaking uncontrollably, and tried to turn it off, but the dial wouldn't budge. It felt like something was holding it in place, as though the radio itself was fighting me. "It's too late." The voice was no longer coming through the radio alone. It was in the room with me, in my ears, surrounding me. The walls seemed to close in, the room growing smaller as I stood there, helpless, my breath ragged. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. The radio went silent. The lights flickered once more and then steadied, the temperature in the room returning to normal. For a long, breathless moment, I stood frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But I didn't need to think about it. I knew I had to leave. Now. I turned, running out of the room and down the hall, grabbing my jacket as I bolted for the front door. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I was outside, my heart racing. I turned back toward the house, the front door now ajar. The light inside flickered through the windows, casting strange, shifting shadows. But the radio was silent now. The house was silent. I never went back to that house again. I still don't know what happened that night or why my grandmother's voice came through the radio, but every now and then I hear the faintest whisper when I'm alone. "Come closer." The Forgotten Path. It was supposed to be a simple hiking trip, just a few hours through the forest near my town. I had done this trail countless times before. The trees were tall and imposing, their leaves a deep shade of green that almost seemed to block out the sky. The ground was soft, covered in a layer of damp leaves, the kind that squelch underfoot. A small creek ran through the area, the sound of water trickling over rocks providing a peaceful soundtrack to the hike. I had been walking for about an hour, the air crisp and cool, when I noticed something strange. A path, partially hidden behind a cluster of overgrown bushes. It wasn't on the map, and it definitely wasn't one I had seen before. The trees seemed to open up just enough to let the path peek through, like it was inviting me to explore. Curiosity got the better of me. I had no real reason to take this detour, but something about it called to me. I pushed aside the branches and stepped onto the path, my boots crunching the fallen leaves. It was narrower than the main trail, barely wide enough for me to walk comfortably. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining above, blocking out much of the daylight. At first, the path seemed harmless. I walked further in, my breath steady and rhythmic, the sounds of the forest fading behind me. I passed a few oddities, a moss-covered stone, a broken branch that seemed too out of place, but nothing unusual. Still, the further I walked, the more oppressive the silence became. It was like the forest was holding its breath. After what felt like an eternity of walking, I came to a clearing. It wasn't large, but it was noticeable in how unnervingly still it was. There were no birds chirping, no rustling of animals in the brush, just an eerie, suffocating silence. In the center of the clearing stood an old stone well, its surface covered in thick moss and vines. It looked ancient, far older than anything else I had seen in the woods. I approached cautiously, my heart beginning to race. Something felt wrong about the well, like it didn't belong here. I leaned over the edge, peering into the darkness below. It was impossible to see how deep it went. Just as I was about to step back, I heard it. A faint sound, like a whisper, coming from the well. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a voice. Soft and distant, but unmistakable. I took a step back, my body tense. My mind screamed at me to leave, but something held me in place. Then, the whisper grew louder. It was clearer now, more urgent, but still indecipherable. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up as the voice seemed to draw closer, like it was calling to me. I could almost feel the weight of its presence, like it was reaching up from the darkness, trying to pull me in. I turned quickly, my heart hammering in my chest. I needed to get out of here. The path that had seemed so inviting now felt suffocating, the trees closing in around me, their branches casting long shadows that seemed to shift as I moved. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest felt unfamiliar now. The path was harder to follow, the landmarks I had passed earlier no longer recognizable. Every sound seemed to echo unnervingly. I could hear my breath, my footsteps, the occasional snap of a twig, but everything else had gone silent. The deeper I went, the more disoriented I became. It was as if the forest itself was changing, shifting in a way I couldn't explain. The trees looked different now, darker and more twisted, their trunks gnarled like ancient fingers reaching for me. I thought I saw something move in the corner of my eye, just a flicker of motion, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. My chest tightened. I was being followed. Panic surged through me, and I broke into a run. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees crowding my vision, the path twisting and turning in unnatural ways. I stumbled, my legs aching, my breath ragged. I had to get out, but no matter how far I ran, the woods never seemed to end. The clearing, the well, the whispering voice, they were all behind me, but somehow they felt closer than ever. Finally, I broke through the trees and stumbled into the main trail. The familiar surroundings did little to calm my nerves. I looked behind me, half expecting to see someone emerging from the shadows, but the forest was silent once more. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my keys, and once I was inside, I slammed the door and locked it, the engine roaring to life as I drove away. But as I looked in the rearview mirror, I could swear I saw something standing at the edge of the forest, just beyond the trees. A figure, watching me. I didn't stop until I was home. But even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whisper, still feel the presence behind me, chasing me through the forest. And I know, deep down, I'll never truly escape. The abandoned arcade. I was in the middle of a late-night walk when I stumbled upon the arcade. I had never seen it before, and I'd walked through this part of the city many times. It stood on a street corner, hidden between two old buildings, its neon sign flickering weakly in the dark. The words came on blinked erratically, like they were trying to spell something, but failing miserably. Curiosity got the best of me, and I found myself walking closer to the entrance. The door was slightly ajar, a faint glow coming from inside. I peered through the gap, half expecting the place to be abandoned. But what caught my eye was the sound of laughter, high-pitched, almost childlike, but unsettling. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, a chill ran down my spine. The place was empty, but the machines were still on. The dim lights from the arcade machines flickered sporadically, casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls. The hum of the machines, the clinking of coins, and the beeping of the games all blended together into a disorienting symphony. I looked around. The walls were covered in old posters, most faded or peeling, some with advertisements for games I didn't recognize. But what stood out most was the smell, like stale popcorn and dust, mixed with something metallic. It wasn't just a rundown arcade, it felt wrong. I wandered further inside, drawn to an old Pac-Man machine at the far end. Its screen was on, but instead of the usual game, it showed a distorted image, glitchy static mixed with flashes of yellow and black. I approached it cautiously, reaching out to press the start button, but just before my fingers touched it, the screen flickered and went black. A voice echoed from behind me. "Play with me." I spun around, heart racing. There was no one there. The room was still empty, the laughter I had heard earlier now replaced by a soft, almost rhythmic sound like tapping on glass. I wanted to leave, but something stopped me. The arcade seemed to pull at me, its eerie atmosphere tugging me further into the shadows. The games around me were still active, some with static-filled screens, others showing distorted images that were difficult to make sense of. It felt like the machines were watching me, waiting. I moved past a row of pinball machines, their lights flashing in a chaotic pattern. A sudden crash rang out from one of them, and I jumped, but when I looked closer, nothing seemed out of place. The ball was just stuck in one of the machines, frozen midair. The air in the arcade grew heavier, the laughter now accompanied by a faint sound of breathing, like someone standing just behind me. I turned around quickly, but the space was still empty. "You're not leaving." I froze. The voice was clearer now, and it was unmistakably coming from the direction of one of the machines. I walked toward the voice, my legs shaking, my breath shallow. As I approached, the sounds grew louder, footsteps, followed by a soft whisper that sent a chill through my body. I didn't want to turn around, but I had to. The voice had come closer, and I could feel the presence behind me. My heart pounded in my chest as I spun around. A shadow loomed, tall and thin, its outline barely visible in the dim light. It was standing near one of the old skee-ball machines, its features distorted and warped like a glitching video game character. It didn't move, just watched me with empty, hollow eyes. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. The presence in the room grew heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on me. The laughter, the breathing, it all became too much. "Play with me," the voice repeated, but this time it wasn't coming from the machines. It was right behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. The shadow had vanished, but the laughter, the strange, rhythmic tapping, continued, growing louder and louder until it felt like it was all around me. The machines, every single one, flickered and buzzed in a chaotic frenzy, as though they were malfunctioning all at once. The lights in the arcade began to flash erratically, casting dark, flickering shadows on the walls. My pulse quickened, and the laughter turned into a garbled, distorted screech that echoed in my ears. Without thinking, I turned and bolted for the door. The moment my hand touched the handle, the lights went out completely. The arcade was plunged into darkness. I yanked the door open, my breath ragged, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't look back as I ran out into the street. I didn't stop until I was blocks away, breathless and drenched in sweat. The city felt normal again, the sounds of traffic and distant voices grounding me. But when I glanced behind me, I saw it, the flickering neon sign of the arcade in the distance. Only, it wasn't there anymore. There was nothing but a blank wall where the entrance had been. I didn't return to that part of the city again. The memory of the arcade, the laughter, and the voice still haunts me. And sometimes, when I walk through the city at night, I swear I can hear the faint sound of a game starting, followed by the whisper, "Play with me." The locked room. I had never been inside that old office building before. It was an odd place, tucked in a corner of the city that no one really seemed to notice, yet there it stood, an aging structure with cracked windows and peeling paint. The sign on the door read Lawson and Finch Consulting, but no one had worked there for years. I'd heard rumors about it being haunted, abandoned after an office incident years ago, but I never paid much attention. It wasn't until I was offered the chance to check it out, just to clear out some files for a small project, that I even thought to step inside. The building had an air of neglect to it. The floors creaked under my feet, and dust clung to every surface. I walked through the main entrance, past rows of empty desks, the chairs turned at strange angles as if abandoned in a hurry. I made my way toward the back, where the file room was supposed to be, my footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. The atmosphere inside was suffocating. The dim fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting an unsettling hum throughout the hall. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and stale air, as though nothing had been touched in years. I finally reached the file room, a small, windowless space at the back of the building. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, a cold draft hit my face. Inside, the shelves were lined with file boxes, most of them stacked haphazardly, some barely held together by old twine. I started going through them, sorting through old documents, but the longer I spent in there, the more uneasy I became. There was something about the room, it felt like it was closing in on me. Every time I moved, I could hear a faint scraping noise from one of the walls, like something or someone was scraping against the plaster. I paused, trying to convince myself it was just the building settling, but the noise didn't stop. It was getting louder, and now it seemed to come from all around me. I stood still for a moment, listening intently. Then I heard it, a faint click, followed by the unmistakable sound of the door behind me creaking closed. I turned around, my heart racing. The door was fully shut now. I stepped toward it, but when I tried to turn the handle, it wouldn't budge. Panic began to rise in my chest as I tugged at the door, but it was as if something was holding it shut from the other side. My breathing quickened, and I started to pound on the door, shouting for help, but no sound escaped my mouth. It was as though the room had swallowed my voice. The walls seemed to press in, the space around me growing smaller, more claustrophobic. The scraping sound was louder now, echoing from the corners, and then I heard it again, just behind me. A whisper. Soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. Stay. I froze. The voice wasn't coming from anyone in the room. It felt like it was coming from the walls themselves, as though the building was alive. I turned around again, desperately searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The file room was still, suffocatingly still. The scraping noise grew louder, like something was digging into the walls, scratching its way through the plaster. I stepped back, my hand trembling as I reached for my phone, hoping for a signal. But the screen was blank. No bars. No signal. I tried calling, but the phone didn't even ring. It was as if I were cut off from the world entirely. Suddenly, I heard the sound of something heavy shifting in the corner. I turned to see a metal filing cabinet, one that had been locked shut when I first entered, slowly inching open by itself. The drawers slid out one by one, creaking, their movement unnatural, like someone or something was forcing them open. Then I saw it. From within the cabinet, a shadow emerged, thin, elongated, its shape distorted and twisted. It seemed to float above the floor, a dark figure that defied the laws of physics. The closer it came, the colder the room became, a freezing chill that made my breath come out in invisible puffs. It moved toward me, gliding silently across the floor, its shape rippling like smoke. I backed away, but my legs felt weak, my feet heavy. I couldn't move fast enough. The shadow was closing in, its presence suffocating, its cold reaching for me. Then I heard the whisper again, this time clearer, more urgent. Don't leave. I shook my head, my mind screaming at me to run. I could see the door now, the handle still unmoving, but just beyond it was the dark figure, blocking my only escape. The air around me thickened, pressing in like I was being crushed under its weight. I gasped for air, but it was as if the room itself had become suffocating. The shadow reached out with a long, skeletal hand. I felt its icy touch on my arm, and a shock of fear jolted through my body. With all the strength I could muster, I lunged toward the door again, my fingers scrabbling against the handle. It turned. I was free. I stumbled out of the room, gasping for air, the hallway stretching out in front of me. But when I looked back, the door was no longer there. The file room had vanished, replaced by a solid wall. The building was silent again, its oppressive weight lifted, but I knew it wasn't over. I had felt it, the cold, the shadow, something was still there, watching me. I didn't look back as I left the building, but I could feel the eyes on me, the whisper still ringing in my ears. Don't leave. The silent tunnel. I had always taken the same path home, even after dark, passing through the same quiet streets and alleyways. But that night, I found myself walking down a different route, one I hadn't noticed before. It was an old tunnel beneath the train tracks, with brick walls covered in moss and ivy. The entrance was barely visible, almost swallowed by the overgrown greenery, but something about it caught my attention as I passed. It was late, and the city was unusually quiet. No cars, no voices, just the distant hum of the urban landscape. On impulse, I decided to step inside. The air was damp, carrying the scent of wet stone and earth. As I walked further into the tunnel, the city noise faded into an unsettling silence. The tunnel stretched on longer than I expected, its darkness almost consuming. I glanced around, my steps echoing in the emptiness. The walls were cracked, the occasional flicker of light from a distant street lamp barely reaching in. I could barely see my feet, and the further I walked, the colder it became. I tightened my jacket and tried to ignore the odd feeling creeping over me. Something was off. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but I could have sworn I heard a faint noise behind me, footsteps, light and quick. I stopped and turned around. The tunnel was empty, just the worn path behind me, but the sound, it kept following me. I started walking faster, my footsteps hastening as the noise seemed to get closer. It wasn't until I reached a bend in the tunnel that I heard something else, something unmistakable. A whisper. "Keep walking." I froze. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but the hairs on my neck stood up. It came from the shadows ahead, though I couldn't see anyone. I took a cautious step forward, hoping to find the source of the voice, but as I did, the temperature dropped even further, and a sudden draft swept through the tunnel, making me shiver. I wanted to turn back, but the whisper had a strange pull on me. It was as if the tunnel itself wanted me to go further. So, I kept walking. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet shifted, and I stumbled. The floor was uneven, the tunnel seemingly alive with subtle shifts and movement. I quickly regained my balance, but the sense of unease grew. Something was wrong, and the whispering grew louder, now accompanied by a soft scraping sound, like nails against stone. "Come closer." The voice was clearer now, almost too close, like it was just behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, this time more forceful, almost frantic. I felt my chest tighten as I began to run, my breath quick and shallow. The footsteps followed me, matching my pace, the scraping growing louder with every step. I didn't dare look back. My heart was racing, my mind screaming at me to get out, but the tunnel stretched on and on, the exit nowhere in sight. The sound of my footsteps was drowned out by the pounding in my chest, and the whispers seemed to echo off the walls, now joined by another sound, the soft, rhythmic thudding of something moving in the dark. "Don't stop." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a command. I could feel it, something pulling at my legs, like unseen hands reaching from the darkness, trying to drag me back. I pushed forward, running faster, adrenaline surging through my veins. But the tunnel never seemed to end. The shadows grew thicker, the darkness more oppressive. I could barely see, only the faint outlines of the walls to guide me. And then, it happened. The tunnel around me seemed to shift again, like a sudden wave of pressure, and I found myself in a different part of the tunnel. The walls here were covered in strange, wet stains, dark and smudged, as though something had been dragged along the ground. The whisper was gone, replaced by a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the stone. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Panic surged through me as I backed away, my mind racing for an explanation. I was no longer alone. Out of the shadows, a figure emerged, its body tall and misshapen, its face obscured by darkness, but its eyes gleamed with a sickly yellow glow. The creature moved slowly toward me, its movements jerky, unnatural, like a broken puppet. I ran again, my legs heavy, the air thick with fear. The creature's growl grew louder, its steps echoing behind me as I stumbled through the dark tunnel, desperately searching for an escape. But there was no way out. The tunnel seemed endless, twisting and turning, narrowing and widening at random. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw a faint light ahead, a street lamp, barely visible through the darkness. I pushed myself toward it, ignoring the pain in my legs, the terror clawing at my throat. With one final burst of strength, I reached the exit. But when I stepped outside, I found myself back at the same entrance. The tunnel stretched before me, endless and dark, the whispering returning, urging me forward. I turned and ran as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I was far, far away from the tunnel, but even then, the whispering stayed with me, echoing in my mind. Keep walking. The Forgotten Store. It was an ordinary Tuesday when I first noticed it. I was walking through the downtown area, just killing time before meeting a friend for dinner, when something caught my eye, an old store I had never seen before. It was tucked between two modern shops, the kind that everyone walked past without a second thought. The faded sign above the door simply read Curiosities in cracked, golden letters. The windows were covered in dust, but through the grime I could make out the faint shapes of strange, mismatched objects on the shelves inside. Something about it intrigued me. I've always had an interest in old, quirky places, so I decided to take a quick look inside. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, but it didn't sound like the usual cheerful chime you'd expect. It was almost hollow, like the store itself was too old to make a sound that didn't carry a hint of something eerie. The inside was dim, the shelves crowded with oddities. There were old clocks, dusty paintings, jars filled with unidentifiable objects, and strange trinkets that looked like they belonged in another time. The smell of aged wood and something else, something metallic, hung in the air. As I wandered deeper, I noticed a tall, thin man behind the counter, his face partially hidden by a dark hood. He didn't greet me, didn't even look up. I felt a strange chill run down my spine, but I pushed it aside, assuming he was just an eccentric owner. The store seemed almost timeless, as if it didn't belong in the present day at all. The air was thick with a sense of waiting, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stepped into a place I wasn't meant to be. I moved toward the back of the store, where a narrow hallway led to a small room. The walls here were lined with shelves holding items that looked even older, books with cracked leather covers, strange statues, and small glass bottles filled with dark liquid. At the far end of the room, there was a large, ornate mirror, its frame twisted and covered in intricate carvings. It was the mirror that drew me in. There was something about its reflection that seemed wrong. The room behind me was dim, and yet the mirror reflected the space in perfect, almost too perfect detail. I leaned in closer, studying it. As I stared at my own reflection, I felt something shift. The image in the mirror began to distort, just slightly, at first. The lighting in the reflection seemed off, darker, colder, and the shadows on the floor deepened unnaturally. I pulled back, my heart racing. The chill in the air intensified, and I could hear the faint sound of whispers, like voices coming from the mirror itself. I looked over at the man behind the counter, but he didn't seem to notice. His back was to me now, his head lowered as though he was doing something on the counter. The whispers grew louder, and I could almost make out words now, although they didn't sound like any language I knew. It was as if the mirror was trying to speak to me, beckon me closer. My hand reached out on its own accord, almost without my consent, and I brushed my fingers against the cold glass. The moment I touched it, the mirror rippled like water, and my reflection warped. The face staring back at me wasn't my own. It was a version of me, yes, but older, with dark, hollow eyes and a twisted smile. I recoiled, heart pounding in my chest. The reflection moved, but I didn't. It tilted its head, as though mocking me, its smile widening. I stumbled backward, and that's when I saw it, a shadow, deep and unnatural, creeping up the side of the mirror. It wasn't the reflection of the room, it was something else, something lurking beyond the glass. It reached out toward me, its shape vague and formless, but its presence was undeniable. It was as if the mirror wasn't a window to a reflection, but a doorway to something darker, something that shouldn't exist. I wanted to run, but my legs felt heavy, as though the room was pressing down on me. The shadow in the mirror grew larger, and the whispers became more frantic, more insistent. My head swam with dizziness, and I could feel the pull of the mirror, drawing me in, trying to drag me closer. But then, the whispers stopped. The room fell silent. I blinked, and for a moment, everything seemed normal again. The mirror was just a mirror, reflecting only the dim light of the store. I glanced around, and the strange feeling I had earlier seemed to be gone. The man behind the counter was still standing motionless, but I didn't hear the whispers anymore. I took a deep breath, my heart still pounding, and turned to leave. But as I stepped toward the door, something caught my eye, a small, silver key resting on the counter where the man had been. I hadn't seen it before. It was old, ornate, and it seemed to glint in the light, as though it had been waiting for me. I turned back to ask the man about it, but he was gone. The counter was empty, as though he had never been there at all. I looked around the store, my chest tight with fear, but everything was still. The shelves, the jars, the mirrors, everything was exactly where it had been. I grabbed the key, my hand trembling as I slid it into my pocket. I didn't know why, but something told me I needed to take it. I hurried out of the store, the bell above the door ringing once more, but this time it didn't sound hollow. It sounded almost relieved. As I stepped into the cool night air, I looked back over my shoulder, half expecting to see the store's door close behind me. But there was nothing. Just the empty street. When I got home that night, I placed the key on my desk and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. But when I glanced at it later, I noticed something strange. The key was glowing. The last train. It was a rainy evening, and the train station felt emptier than usual. I'd been to this station countless times before, just another part of my daily commute, but tonight was different. There was an eerie stillness in the air, a sense of something off, though I couldn't place it. The sound of the rain against the platform was the only thing breaking the silence, and even that seemed muffled, as if the world had been wrapped in a thick, damp blanket. I glanced at my watch. The last train of the night was due in a few minutes. I didn't mind the late hours. I was used to the quiet atmosphere at this time. I'd always preferred the solitude. As I waited, I noticed that the usual buzz of conversation from other passengers was absent. I looked around. The platform, which would typically have been crowded with people rushing to catch their trains, was nearly empty. There was just one other person, a woman, standing across the tracks near the far end of the platform. She was dressed in a long, dark coat, the hood pulled up over her head so I couldn't make out her face. For a moment, I considered walking over to say something. It felt odd to be the only two people there, but I quickly dismissed the thought. I wasn't in the mood for small talk. Besides, she looked like she was waiting for someone, maybe the same train as me. As the minutes passed, I noticed something else, a strange sensation, like the air had thickened around me. The station, normally buzzing with the sound of trains, was eerily quiet. I strained my ears, but I couldn't hear anything. No distant rumble of an approaching train, no sound of the old speakers blaring out announcements. Nothing. The train was late, which wasn't unusual, but there was something unsettling about the silence. The lights above flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the platform. I glanced over at the woman again. She hadn't moved, still standing in the same spot, her head slightly tilted, as if listening for something. I checked my watch again. The train should have been here by now. My nerves started to itch, a growing feeling of discomfort that I couldn't shake off. My fingers gripped the strap of my bag a little tighter as I stared down the empty tracks. And then, the woman began to move. At first, I thought she was just shifting, maybe pulling her coat tighter around herself against the cold wind, but she didn't walk toward the train. Instead, she began to slowly walk along the edge of the platform, her steps deliberate, as if she was searching for something. The odd part was that she didn't seem to be looking at anything specific, just walking, her eyes fixed straight ahead. Her pace was slow, almost unnatural, as though she wasn't in any hurry. My unease grew. I couldn't take my eyes off her. The woman's presence, the way she moved, there was something distinctly wrong about it. I wanted to call out, ask her if she was okay, but the words caught in my throat. Suddenly, the distant sound of a train horn broke through the stillness. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned toward the sound, hoping that it was finally here. But the train wasn't visible. Instead, the lights at the far end of the platform flickered once more, then went out completely. A deep darkness seemed to swallow that end of the station, and for a moment, I felt like I was suspended in time. I should have left. I should have turned around and walked away. But something kept me rooted to the spot. The faint sound of the train grew louder, closer. The tracks began to rumble beneath me, as if the train was speeding toward us at an alarming rate, but I still couldn't see it. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The silence returned. I turned toward the woman again, and this time, she was standing at the edge of the tracks, facing me. Her hood was still up, but I could see her face now, pale and expressionless. Her eyes were wide, dark, almost lifeless, staring directly at me. There was something about them, something cold, empty, as if she wasn't really there. A chill ran down my spine. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but before I could speak, the woman began to move again, this time towards the edge of the platform. She stepped closer to the tracks, her feet slowly lifting as if she was about to step down onto the rails. "No, wait!" I shouted without thinking, rushing toward her. But it was too late. With one last, slow movement, she stepped off the platform, disappearing into the darkness of the tracks below. I rushed forward, heart pounding, trying to catch her, but when I reached the edge of the platform, there was nothing, no trace of her, no sound of footsteps, nothing. I stood there for a moment, breathless, staring at the empty track, my heart still racing. The train, which should have arrived by now, never did. The station was silent once more, the air thick and oppressive. I turned to leave, but something stopped me. I looked down at the spot where she had been standing. A small object glinted in the dim light. Hesitant, I bent down to pick it up, my hands trembling. It was a train ticket, old, worn, and faded, but the date was clear. Today's date, the one for the last train. My stomach twisted. I had been the only one here. The woman, had she ever existed at all? With the ticket clutched tightly in my hand, I turned and walked out of the station, leaving behind the empty platform and the unanswered questions. The quiet room. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when I found myself wandering through the halls of the old hospital. I had never been a patient there, nor did I have any connection to the building, but something strange had drawn me in. The hospital had been closed for years, and most of the rooms had been abandoned, but I had heard rumors about a particular part of the hospital, a place where time seemed to stand still. The kind of place you didn't go unless you were looking for something that you couldn't find anywhere else. I had come here on a whim, not really sure what I was expecting. I was looking for something to break the monotony of my life. But I hadn't anticipated this. The main floor was quiet, and I only heard my own footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. The smell of old antiseptic and something musty lingered in the air. The faded tiles on the floor creaked as I walked past rooms that had long since been stripped of their medical equipment. The walls were peeling, and the windows were cracked, letting in the fading light of the late afternoon. As I turned a corner, I noticed a door at the end of the hallway. It was different from the others, newer, more solid. There was something odd about it. It didn't belong here. I approached it, my footsteps slowed. The brass doorknob glinted faintly in the light, and I wondered how it had remained untouched all this time. I didn't hesitate long. Something inside me urged me to open it. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. There was no furniture, nothing except for a single, worn chair sitting in the center of the space. The walls were covered in faint, strange markings, as if they had been scratched into the plaster over time. I stepped inside, immediately feeling the temperature drop by several degrees. A chill settled over me, and my breath became visible in the air. I could hear the faint hum of the lights above, but otherwise, the room was eerily silent. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. For a moment, I stood still, taking in the room. I was certain I had heard something. A faint sound, like a whisper, coming from somewhere within the walls. But when I turned, nothing was there. My pulse quickened. I sat down in the chair. It felt cold against my skin, but not in the way that old metal should feel. It was as if the chair had been waiting for me. The air around me grew heavier, the silence pressing in. And then, the whisper came again. This time, it was clearer. I couldn't make out the words, but there was no mistaking the sound. It was coming from right next to me, just behind my ear. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. My mind screamed at me to leave, but my body refused to move. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. It was calling my name. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was nothing there, only the empty room and the walls that seemed to close in on me. The whisper continued, now sounding like a chant, the voice indistinguishable from the air itself, but I could feel it crawling under my skin. My fingers dug into the armrests of the chair. The room felt like it was shrinking, suffocating me. Sweat broke out on my forehead, and I could feel my breath becoming shallow. The temperature had dropped so much that I could see my own breath in the air. The whisper became a scream, and in that moment, I realized that it wasn't coming from anywhere at all. It was coming from inside my own head. A voice, no, not a voice, but a feeling telling me to stay. Telling me not to leave. But the instinct to escape was stronger. I stood up quickly, my legs shaking. My heart was pounding so loudly that it drowned out everything else. I rushed toward the door, but when I grabbed the doorknob, it wouldn't budge. I twisted harder, but it remained locked in place, as if the room itself had sealed me in. Panic surged through me. My mind raced, looking for another way out. The walls seemed to be breathing, pulsating with some unseen force, and the room felt alive in a way that no building should. The shadows seemed to deepen around me, as if they were closing in on me, inch by inch. I slammed my body against the door, desperate to break free. Finally, with a loud crack, the door swung open. I stumbled out of the room, gasping for air. The hallway outside was the same, empty, quiet. No one was around, but the feeling of being watched lingered, like a shadow at the edge of my vision. I didn't stop to look back. I couldn't. I hurried down the hallway, my footsteps echoing louder than before, but I didn't care. The hallway seemed longer than it should be. It stretched on, and the light above flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows on the walls. When I finally reached the exit, I burst through the door into the fresh air, my chest heaving. The weight on my chest lifted, but I knew the feeling wasn't gone. I turned to look at the building one last time. The windows were dark, but as I stood there, I swear I saw movement, a shadow flitting behind one of them. I didn't stick around to see who, or what, was there. I walked away quickly, and I never went back. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear that whisper in the back of my mind, calling me back to that room. The broken mirror. The first time I stepped into that antique store, I felt like something was watching me. The heavy scent of old wood and dust filled the air, mixed with the faint odor of something musty, as if the place had been shut for years. The shop was small, tucked away on a quiet side street I had never noticed before. I was just passing by, on my way home from work, when something inside the store caught my attention, a flash of light through the dusty window. The sign above the door read, "The Curio Shop." The name sounded strange, almost like it belonged in a forgotten time. I pushed the door open, and the bell above it jingled as I stepped inside. The store was packed with oddities, shelves piled high with trinkets, vintage lamps, old clocks, and paintings with thick, cracked frames. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with a long white beard, was sitting behind the counter, his eyes barely lifting from a book. I nodded at him, but he didn't acknowledge me. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on the pages, as though he wasn't really there. I wandered deeper into the store, running my fingers over the war items that seemed to hold secrets from another time. It wasn't the sort of place you'd visit for anything practical. It was filled with curiosities, things that might interest collectors, or perhaps someone like me, just looking for a momentary distraction from the usual routine. Then I saw it. A large, ornately framed mirror hung in the corner of the room. The frame was intricate, carved with strange symbols that I didn't recognize, and the glass was old, slightly clouded, but still reflective. I found myself drawn to it, unable to take my eyes away. The mirror was unlike any I had ever seen before. It felt different. I stepped closer, tilting my head slightly. The reflection staring back at me wasn't exactly the same as what I had seen in other mirrors. The room behind me looked distorted, as if the glass was bending the light. But it was more than that. There was something off about it, like I was staring into a version of myself that didn't belong. I leaned in, and for a brief second, I saw something in the reflection that made my stomach twist. Just for a moment, my own face looked older, worn. The shadows under my eyes were darker, and my expression was hollow, like I had been trapped in that mirror for years. It was fleeting, gone as quickly as it appeared, but the image haunted me. Suddenly, the bell rang again, and I jumped back, startled. I turned, and a woman had entered the store. She was dressed in a long, dark coat, her face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. She looked around quickly, then made her way to the counter, where the shopkeeper raised his head slightly to acknowledge her. But it wasn't her presence that bothered me, it was the way she looked at the mirror. She didn't glance at it like I had, but stared directly into it, her gaze fixed with such intensity that I felt a shiver run down my spine. For a moment, I wondered if she had been standing there the entire time, watching me. I stepped away from the mirror, my heart beginning to race. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. I turned back toward the counter, but the woman was already gone. I glanced over at the mirror one last time. The reflection was different now, blurred, like someone had smeared the glass. The distorted version of me was still there, but now it seemed closer. It was as if the reflection was trying to reach out to me. I stepped back quickly, my breath shallow, and I noticed something else. The reflection in the mirror wasn't just me, it was moving on its own. My reflection was turning its head, its eyes following me, even though I hadn't moved. My pulse quickened, and I instinctively reached for my phone, but I realized I hadn't seen it since I entered the store. I searched my pockets in a panic, but it was gone. I turned toward the shopkeeper, but he was still sitting there, his eyes fixed on his book, as though nothing was happening. I tried to call out to him, but my voice caught in my throat, the words coming out as a faint whisper. I turned back to the mirror. This time, the reflection was no longer distorted. It had become clearer, but there was something wrong with it. The person in the glass, me, was smiling. A smile that wasn't my own. It was wide and twisted, as if I had been replaced by something else. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the room, and the mirror surface fractured. The reflection flickered, and for a moment, I could see a dark shape behind me, standing in the shadows, watching. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned to leave, but the shop door wouldn't open. I pushed against it, but it remained sealed shut, as if the store itself had locked me in. I was trapped. Behind me, I heard the sound of something dragging across the floor. Slowly, I turned. The woman in the dark coat had reappeared, but she was standing in front of the mirror now, staring at me with an expression of pure, unblinking focus. The reflection of me in the mirror was smiling even wider now, and as I looked, I realized that the reflection wasn't mine anymore. The woman in the coat had stepped into the glass. She wasn't standing in front of it, she was inside it, her hands pressing against the surface, trying to claw her way out. Her eyes locked onto mine, wide with fear. And then, in a single heartbeat, everything went black. I woke up outside, lying on the cold pavement in front of the shop. My body ached, but I couldn't remember how I had gotten there. The antique store was gone, completely vanished. The street was empty, as if it had never existed. I never spoke about it to anyone, but I knew that the shop had never been just a shop. It had been something far worse, something I was lucky to have escaped from. But sometimes, when I pass by an antique store or see a mirror hanging on a wall, I wonder if the woman ever found her way out. the last stop. I was on my way home after a long day at work, exhausted and ready to collapse onto my couch. The bus I usually took had just left when I ran to the stop, cursing under my breath. There wasn't another one for another 15 minutes, and with the weather turning colder, I didn't feel like standing out in the chill. As I waited, I noticed a small, nearly hidden kiosk at the end of the street, its sign reading Timeless Goods. I hadn't seen it there before, though I had walked this route countless times. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to step inside, mostly to pass the time and escape the biting wind. The moment I entered, a strange, musty scent filled my nose, mixed with a faint hint of incense. The shop was dimly lit, the only light coming from an overhead lamp that flickered occasionally, casting eerie shadows on the old wooden shelves lining the walls. The place was cramped, with clutter everywhere. Old books stacked haphazardly, tarnished trinkets, and dusty vases seemed to fill every available space. The air felt thick, almost like time itself had settled here and refused to move on. Behind the counter stood an elderly woman, her eyes hidden beneath a heavy set of wrinkles, though her smile was wide and welcoming. "Looking for something?" she asked, her voice gentle yet firm, as though she had been expecting me. I nodded, unsure of what to say. "Just browsing." "Take your time," she said, her smile never wavering. "Everything has its place here." I wandered deeper into the shop, running my fingers over the old items on display. There was something oddly comforting about the quiet, but also unsettling. The shelves were packed with items from another era, outdated radios, broken clocks, tarnished silverware, and strange dolls with glassy eyes. But what caught my attention most was an old, withered suitcase sitting in the corner, tucked under a shelf. It was different from everything else, well-worn, but carefully preserved, as though it had a story to tell. I knelt beside it, lifting it carefully. The leather felt cold to the touch, and when I ran my fingers over its surface, I felt an odd tingle, like static electricity. There was a faded tag attached to the handle, but the writing was so worn I could barely make it out. I squinted, trying to decipher it, but the words seemed to shift in and out of focus. "The last stop," I read aloud, before quickly shutting the suitcase. The elderly woman appeared at my side, her sudden presence making me jump. "You've found it," she said, her voice low, as though it was a secret shared only between us. "It's for the ones who are lost." I stared at her, confused, and before I could speak, she continued. "Once you touch it, you'll understand. But once you leave, there's no going back." I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, but I couldn't help myself. The suitcase had a strange pull, an undeniable urge to open it. I nodded slowly and set it down on the counter, unlocking the rusty latches. When I lifted the lid, I expected to find clothes or old photographs, but instead, the inside was empty except for a small, folded piece of paper. I unfolded it carefully, reading the only words written on it, "For those who leave but never return." The paper felt unnervingly cold, like it had been pulled from the depths of some forgotten place. The moment I read the words, a strange sensation gripped me. The lights in the shop flickered and dimmed, and the temperature dropped several degrees. I felt an oppressive weight in the air, like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't quite comprehend. The shopkeeper's smile had vanished, and she stepped back, her eyes narrowing. "You've made your choice now." Suddenly, the world around me began to shift. The floor beneath my feet seemed to warp, and the walls of the shop began to twist, like the room itself was bending, reshaping. I tried to call out, but my voice was muffled, as if someone had stuffed cotton into my ears. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed for the door, but it was no longer there. The shop was gone, replaced by a narrow alley, cold and dark, stretching out into an endless void. I turned around, trying to find any sign of the shop or the elderly woman, but there was nothing. Just an endless, suffocating blackness. My heart raced, and I realized the silence was deafening. I was alone, trapped in this strange, hollow space. The sensation of being pulled further into the darkness was overwhelming, like I was being consumed by it. I stumbled forward, looking for something to hold on to, but the alley seemed to stretch endlessly, no end in sight. I ran, but it felt like I was standing still, my footsteps echoing in the void, louder with each step. The words of the woman echoed in my mind, "Once you leave, there's no going back." And then, just as I thought I couldn't take another step, the void started to pulse. A low, rumbling hum filled the air, and I saw it, a light at the far end of the alley. It was faint, but it was there. I sprinted towards it, desperate for something, anything to escape this strange, oppressive place. As I reached the light, I was blinded by its brightness, and then, in an instant, I was back at the bus stop. The familiar street, the cars, the sounds of the city, everything was just as it had been when I first arrived. I stumbled backward, shaking, my breath ragged. The suitcase, the shop, the alley, they were gone. The only thing left was a strange coldness that lingered on my skin and the sense that something had changed inside me. I never saw the shop again, but sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear the hum. That same rumbling noise, as if something is waiting just beyond the edge of my vision. I don't know if it's real, but I can never quite shake the feeling that I'm still standing at the last stop, waiting for something that I can't see. The vanishing light. It was late, later than I usually stayed at work, but I had been wrapping up a project and was too tired to think about going home. The office, as always, was mostly empty by then, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead the only sound breaking the silence. The quiet usually felt comforting to me, but tonight there was something off. A strange unease that made the stillness feel heavy, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I grabbed my bag and stood up, stretching my sore muscles. I needed to catch the last subway home, and I didn't want to miss it. As I walked out of my cubicle, I noticed a faint flicker of light down the hallway. It wasn't unusual for the lights to malfunction here, but this was different. The light didn't flicker in a regular pattern, it blinked erratically, as if something was trying to turn it on but couldn't. Curious, I walked toward it. The hallway was empty, the low murmur of air conditioning the only sound. The light continued to blink, casting strange shadows on the walls as I passed. As I approached, I saw that the light was coming from one of the supply closets at the end of the corridor. I frowned, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Something about the situation felt off, but I couldn't place it. Maybe it was the way the flickering light seemed to pull me in, or maybe it was the fact that the office had been empty for hours and I should have been heading out. But I couldn't stop myself. I turned the knob. The door opened to a small, dark closet filled with shelves of office supplies, paper, pens, cleaning products, but the light didn't seem to be coming from any of the overhead bulbs. Instead, it came from something in the corner of the closet, something I couldn't immediately identify. A small, dusty box sat on the floor, its lid slightly ajar. I bent down to investigate it, and the second my fingers brushed against it, the light flickered violently, blinding me for a second. When my vision cleared, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. The walls of the closet seemed to stretch inwards, as if the space was bending, folding in on itself. The shelves, once orderly, were now warped and distorted, their contents spilling out in chaotic disarray. I jerked back, suddenly feeling a rush of panic. I hadn't imagined it. The space was changing. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. The light blinked again, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. My breath quickened, and my heart began to pound in my chest as I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. I heard a sound then, a low, deep hum, coming from the far corner of the closet. I spun around, my eyes wide, searching for its source. There, in the corner, something moved. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I stepped closer, I saw it, a figure, hunched over, its face hidden in shadows. I froze, my legs like lead. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence. The room felt colder, the air heavier, and the hum grew louder. My mind raced with questions. Was this real? Was I hallucinating? But I couldn't escape it. The figure's head slowly turned toward me, its face still obscured by darkness. Then, the light flickered again, and everything around me seemed to blur. The walls twisted even further, and I felt like I was being pulled into the very fabric of the room. The figure was no longer in the corner. It was standing right in front of me, its face still hidden, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold, piercing, like it was looking straight through me. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The air was thick, suffocating. The hum was deafening now, like it was coming from inside my own head. The walls pressed in, and the floor beneath me seemed to dissolve into nothingness. With all the strength I had left, I forced myself to take a step back. The door, somehow, was now slightly ajar. Without thinking, I lunged toward it, throwing my body against it. The door creaked open, and I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. The hallway was still empty. The lights were back to normal, the usual steady glow that I was so used to. But something had changed. My heart was still racing, and I could feel the cold sweat on my skin. I didn't know what had just happened. I didn't know if it had been real or if I had imagined the whole thing. But the feeling of being watched, of something lingering just beyond my perception, didn't leave me. I made my way to the elevator, my fingers trembling as I pressed the button to call it. When the doors opened, I stepped inside, relieved to be leaving the building behind. The elevator descended smoothly, but when it reached the ground floor, the doors didn't open. I pressed the button again, but nothing happened. The lights flickered once more, and the air felt heavier, as if the building itself was closing in on me. Finally, the doors opened, but what I saw wasn't the lobby of the building. Instead, there was darkness, pure, inky blackness that stretched beyond the elevator, like there was nothing else. And then I heard it, a whisper, low and breathless, coming from the shadows. Leave before it's too late. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran. The forgotten path. It had been a long day, and I was finally escaping the city's bustle for the quiet of the woods. I had been wanting to take a walk along the trail for weeks, a break from the noise and stress of work. The air was crisp, fresh, and the scent of pine mixed with the earthy smell of wet leaves. It was the perfect evening to clear my head, so I grabbed my jacket and headed to the outskirts of town. The trailhead was just beyond the park, a winding path that led deeper into the woods. The sun had already started to dip below the horizon, leaving behind a soft amber glow that danced through the trees. I had walked this trail many times before, so I wasn't concerned. The path was familiar, the same one I'd walked countless times during my childhood, though today something felt different. The trees were thicker than I remembered, their gnarled branches twisting high above like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder as I ventured deeper into the woods, and soon I realized I was walking further than usual. I glanced back, but the trail behind me had vanished, swallowed by the dense underbrush. I shrugged it off, assuming I had simply taken a wrong turn, but there was no real path in sight. I kept walking, the crunch of dry leaves beneath my boots the only sound breaking the silence. As I continued, I noticed the woods growing unusually still, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. There was no rustling in the leaves, no birdsong, just the oppressive quiet. I felt a prickling on the back of my neck, as if something was watching me. Just when I thought about turning back, I saw it, a faint light flickering through the trees. It was weak, like a lantern, but it beckoned me, a distant glow that seemed almost out of place in the growing darkness. Without thinking, I moved toward it. The light grew clearer as I got closer, illuminating a clearing that I had never seen before. The trees had parted to reveal a small, crumbling stone structure, half sunken into the earth, its surface covered in moss and vines. It looked ancient, like something forgotten by time. A strange, eerie hum emanated from the structure, vibrating in the air. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, a wave of unease washing over me. The light wasn't coming from anywhere obvious. There were no lanterns or torches, just the strange flickering glow that seemed to pulse from the stones themselves. My curiosity pushed me forward, and I stepped into the clearing, the soft dirt beneath my feet giving way as I approached the structure. The moment I stepped closer, the hum grew louder, resonating in my chest. I reached out to touch the stones, my fingers brushing against the cool surface, and immediately the ground beneath me trembled. A deep, rumbling sound echoed from the structure, and the trees around the clearing began to sway, as if reacting to the energy emanating from it. Suddenly, I heard it, a low whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Leave." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was distant, but it felt as though it was coming from all directions at once. It wasn't a sound, but a presence. A feeling. I stepped back, my instinct screaming at me to run, but the ground was unsteady, and I stumbled. When I looked up, I saw that the trees had closed in around the clearing, trapping me inside. The sky above had darkened, and the air felt thick with an oppressive weight. I turned to leave, but the path had disappeared. There was no way out. Panic surged through me as I spun around, trying to find any sign of the way I had come. That's when I saw it, the figures. Shadows, indistinct, yet unmistakably human. They stood at the edge of the trees, watching me. Their eyes glowed faintly, red, as if they were waiting for something. I opened my mouth to call out, but no sound came. My throat felt dry, and my heart raced in my chest. I stumbled backward, my feet catching on the uneven ground, and fell into the mossy earth. The shadows didn't move, but their eyes followed me, piercing through the darkness. The hum grew louder, vibrating in the air, and the light from the stones flickered wildly. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. I turned again, desperate to find the path, but the shadows were closing in. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if they knew there was no escape. I ran, the ground beneath me shifting, and the air thickening. Every step felt like I was wading through water. I could hear the whispers now, clearer, closer, like they were speaking directly into my mind. "Stay. Stay." I didn't dare look back as I pushed through the trees, trying to find any sign of the familiar trail. But the forest seemed endless, the trees closing in tighter, their branches creaking like old bones. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, and my legs burned with exhaustion. I saw the clearing again, the stone structure looming in the distance, its flickering light mocking me. It was as if the forest itself had rearranged itself, trapping me in a cycle that led me back to that cursed place. The figures were still there, standing motionless, their red eyes fixed on me. I stumbled, falling to my knees, unable to keep running. The forest felt alive now, alive in a way that made my skin crawl. The whispers became louder, more insistent. Stay, stay forever. I didn't know how much time passed before I woke up. The sun was high in the sky, and I found myself sitting in the middle of the trail. The trees were still and silent, just like they had always been, and there was no sign of the stone structure or the shadows. It felt like nothing had changed. But when I stood up and brushed myself off, I noticed something strange. My hands were covered in moss, and my shoes were caked with dirt I didn't remember stepping through. And when I looked behind me, the path I had just walked down wasn't the one I remembered. It was different, twisted, as though I had never been on it at all. I turned and started walking again, but this time the air didn't feel quite so fresh. The trees, once so familiar, now seemed to whisper, their branches shifting unnaturally in the wind. And deep in the distance, I could have sworn I saw something moving. I didn't stop, but the feeling lingered. Something in those woods was waiting. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.